Chapter 420. After Lionel was settled in, he became shocked by this sudden change. The Empire was attacking Camelot? No, maybe he wasn't so surprised about this much. This was the way of the Empire. Ever since they had taken power, they had never allowed any true threats to their sovereignty to survive. Maybe only the Slayer Legion could accomplish such a feat, but even then, they had only been able to do so by hiding away and tucking their tails for decades on end. However, compared to the Slayer Legion, Camelot's location was laid bare for all to see. There was no chance to hide or be covert, and maybe even they weren't aware of why they had to do so either. As far as citizens of Camelot were concerned, they were in the same location as they'd always been. As for their rulers, many of them might have an inkling, but only Mordred knew exactly what was happening thanks to the trial grounds she shared with Lionel. So, what Lionel was maybe truly surprised about was the fact Mordred had reached out to him at all. Though it couldn't be said that they were enemies, a few months ago all of Lionel's thoughts were filled with how to kill this woman. It was only after seeing her backstory and sympathizing with her that he couldn't bear to do so any longer. Lionel couldn't help but hesitate. The Empire was attacking Camelot. Was this really something he should be interfering in? What could he even do? He felt that Mordred overestimated him due to his talent. Let alone the fact that Lionel had yet to meet the other talents of Earth and wasn't exactly certain how he stacked up to them. Even if he was far beyond what they could match, it simply wouldn't matter. None of them even knew his name. And, by the time he proved he had strength and should be listened to, had likely be an enemy of them all. This was the Empire they were talking about. They weren't exactly great listeners. On top of that, Lionel didn't owe Camelot anything. If anything, he had saved them. What reason did he have to protect them? If Lionel placed his bias against the Empire aside and looked at the bigger picture, if the people of Camelot were under the rulership of the Ascension Empire, they'd be much safer. Did I really just think that? How safe were the people of the fort when the nobles decided to abandon them? Lionel sighed and shook his head. Whatever, it doesn't matter. It wasn't Camelot that asked me for help but the Demon Empire. That was right. Most of the reasons Camelot was such a bad place to live in the first place was because of the existence of the Demon Empire. It would be quite ridiculous if he went to save the demons that made their lives a living hell to begin with. Aina watched from the side, her expression far less playful now. She could almost see the struggle on Lionel's face as he wrestled with whether to do something rational or foolish. How do you feel about the Empire? Aina suddenly said. I don't like it. Lionel replied absent-mindedly. And why is that? They don't value lives. They treat their citizens like they can be plugged into risk assessment equations and deleted whenever they've overstayed their welcome. They don't keep tabs on the corruption of their nobles, letting them do as they please. They monitor the every movement of their people as though they were cattle rather than human beings. Lionel rattled off his thoughts almost like a machine. Compared to people who didn't normally understand what they were feeling and why, Lionel's ability practically didn't allow him to do this. His every thought had a very logical reason behind it, at least logical to himself. This was why his feelings for Aina were so incomprehensible. They were the one thing about himself that he truly couldn't explain. And it was ironically the one thing that he didn't try too hard to explain either. Isn't the answer simple, then? Aina said with a smile. Who cares about anything else as long as you're standing in their way? Lionel snapped out of his rant, his eyes brightening as he shot a glance toward Aina. You're right. Lionel grinned. The bird in Lionel's palm had an amulet around its neck. Lionel didn't need to think much about it to understand what it was. On the amulet, there was a key of some sort. Of course, this key wasn't physical but was rather drawn as an art. This key represented the location coordinates of a teleportation reception pad. If Lionel used this key as the core of a large-scale teleportation array, he would be able to go directly toward where Mordred was. It will take me quite a few hours to finish drawing this array. Let's find a secluded place. Aina followed after Lionel quietly. Though Lionel's reasons for doing this were quite simple and pure, Aina's couldn't be categorized as such. In her mind, the more chaos her world was in, the more battles she would be able to participate in and the faster she would be able to strengthen herself. This was what she cared about the very most. Plus, she was absolutely certain that if the Empire was making such big moves, it was impossible for the hidden families to not be involved. Earth's second moon, dubbed Camelot, was still the very same mess of torrential rain it had been when Lionel left it. However, this time, it had been splintered in a large-scale war the likes of which it had not seen in a very long time. After scouting out the moon, the Empire concluded that the best target would be the Demon Empire. From their understanding, Camelot's kingdom had greatly weakened after losing 6 Knights of the Round Table and 2 3-star Magi. In such a vulnerable position, if the Empire swooped in and eliminated the threat that had been plaguing them for centuries, how many would willingly choose to leave the rulership of King Arthur? Gazing toward the no-man's land of Camelot, a familiar young man with white gold hair and shimmering emerald eyes stood amidst the heavy rain. However, every drop that approached him rebounded off of a golden barrier, becoming sparkling motes of light as they scattered. Compared to when he was in the presence of his grandfather, Noah's demeanor was far more level-headed and peaceful. Though he lacked the arrogance one would expect from a prince between his brow, he had a natural air of superiority about him, one ingrained down to his very bones. "The meeting is beginning, Your Highness." Noah nodded and made his way to an elaborate tent covered in soft, black bear fur. It too seemed unblemished by the rain. Chapter 421. The tent was massive, reaching 10 meters into the sky and 20 in every other direction. Though it couldn't be considered to be lavishly decorated, everything was neatly arranged and not even the fibers of the beast's skin carpet swayed out of proper order. The lights were dim, but warm, and a smell of harmonious nature hung in the air. In truth, it seemed more like the abode of a warlord than an empire's prince. But it exuded an air of dominance and demanded absolute obedience at the same time. Numerous young faces all turned toward Noah at once and rose from their seated positions. Not a single one showed even a hint of disrespect. In fact, some of them looked on with trepidation. Noah maintained an even pace as he made his way to the head of the table. It was only after he sat that the others followed suit, a heaviness reigning over the atmosphere. This wasn't the first time Noah had led an expedition. With their talent, many of them had entered zones and invalid clearing teams with him in the past. They knew how he operated and how meticulous he was. Stepping out of line wasn't acceptable. This was why the tent had been completely silent before he entered and, even after he did, it remained as such. Noah glanced toward the 3-dimensional map that spread out across the table. This map was actually the representation of top-of-the-line nanotechnology. Under normal conditions, it would blend into the table and be invisible. However, after observing a target, it would perfectly replicate a scaled version. In fact, if fitted with all the bells and whistles necessary, it could even provide live observation of a target. Unfortunately, they had only been able to deploy a small portion of this technology. Unlocking the full scope of its abilities would require deploying force disruption towers all across this second moon. But that obviously was not possible for now. After a long while, Noah finally spoke. "What is the report on their strength?" "According to our scouts, they are infinitely close to a 4th-dimensional world in strength, Your Highness. The main targets to look out for are those they call the Demon Lords, the Knight of the Round Table, and the 3-star Magi. Aside from this, the most powerful existences on this moon are characters they know as King Arthur, Queen Guinevere, Lancelot, and Mordred." The youths looked toward each other with weird gazes. Did they get dropped into a fairy tale or something? Though they had been briefed on the truth behind the appearance of this second moon, it was still too hard for them to accept. How could stories become real? And if stories could become real, where exactly was the blurred line between reality and fiction? However, considering the identity of the young woman who had spoken, none of them dared to make jokes about it easily. If Noah was the one they feared the most, this young lady was very much a close second. She had a slender little button nose and short cropped hair that made her look quite adorable. That coupled with her short stature of barely 54 inch and her petite frame made her seem like a treasure everyone wanted to protect. That was until you heard her cold voice and saw those piercing blue eyes. She seemed to bore into your soul with her every action, shocking your system with ice. This young lady was the youngest daughter of the Grand Prime Minister's Scarlet family, Jessica Scarlet. Much like Governor Duke was a fusion of the Governor and Duke titles, the Grand Prime Minister was a fusion of the Grand Duke and Prime Minister titles. While there were 8 Governor Dukes, the Empire only had 2 Grand Prime Ministers. And, while the territories of the Governor Dukes were out of the capital, the Grand Prime Ministers had the most prestigious province as their stomping grounds. Jessica was too young to be in line for any hereditary titles and was technically not meant to gain much power from her family as a result, but her own abilities spoke too loudly. Still, despite the fact she was more than worthy to fight for the position of Grand Prime Minister in the future, she had practically been a glorified secretary to Noah since she was 13 years old. Even now that she was almost 23, she hadn't deviated from this role at all. In fact, the only difference between her past self and her current self was that she had swapped out her usual gray pantsuit for a flexible leather-patched armor. From afar, she looked no different from a female sniper to assassin, even down to the numerous knives strapped across her body. Despite her small stature, she had quite a good figure as well. This much was clear even when she wore those gray pantsuits. Not that anyone dared to look, anyway. Maybe Jessica was the only one who could read out names like Mordred and King Arthur without bursting into a fit of laughter. It was clear that she found nothing funny about it. Or maybe she didn't have much of a sense of humor to begin with. Infinitely close to the 4th dimension? A young man asked. How did they manage to pull this off? The other youths nodded. They too were curious about this. From their understanding, this world shouldn't be so strong. After all, it came from an SS grade zone. It's impossible to tell so early on. Jessica replied coldly. Our best guess is that their force seems to be several times thicker than the norm. It is likely that they have a technique able to thicken force beyond the normal limits. This much has also been partially confirmed from other avenues of intelligence. After allowing the youths to murmur amongst each other for a while, Noah finally spoke again. Our target is the Demon Empire. What are the main pitfalls? The first is their numbers. The second is our ignorance. The last is their terrain advantage. Jessica replied efficiently. Their numbers aren't only made up of demon lords, but also large hordes of demonic beasts. They seem to have some methods of controlling these hordes, though not with great accuracy. Secondly, we are ignorant of much of their methods. They seem to employ a branch of force arts for what they call magic or mage arts. We are still gathering information on this. I suggest that we send a few ambassadors to their kingdom and form friendly relations. Lastly, the terrain. Their so-called Demon Empire's core is located within a mountainous region. It's almost impossible to launch a large-scale attack. Noah nodded, tapping lightly on the table. His mind spun quickly, his gaze locking on to the mountainous regions Jessica mentioned. A suffocating aura exuded from the young prince. At that moment, many around him could hardly breathe. Seemingly used to such a thing, they could only clench their jaws, waiting for it to pass. Finally, the tapping stopped. Forming diplomatic relations is not a bad idea, but it will take too long. Imperial Grandfather granted us 3 months at most to complete this mission. We can't afford to waste it. Since there is no path of attack through the mountains, we will make one. Implement the detonation plan of 2097. Jessica, you will lead your squad to deal with the demonic beasts. The more you pull into our control, the better. You have 2 weeks. Finally, send an ultimatum to this King Arthur. It's either he helps us to level this demon empire, or, after we're done, hell be next. Chapter 422. A sudden flash caught the patrolling guards by surprise. The location was a dark castle hidden within the depths of a mountainous region. It was designed so well that it seemed to blend into the jagged structure of the mountains around it, giving off a dark and sinister vibe. It was safe to say that such a region rarely, if ever, received visitors. And those who could use this teleportation platform were even rarer. However, the guards were even more shocked when they realized that their 2 guests were humans. Any other guards would likely lash out with an attack by now. But these guards were so used to doing nothing that they were stunned for a moment, not knowing how they should react. At that moment, Lionel's vision cleared and he locked eyes on the two demon guards before him. Both of them were women dressed a bit too scantily for a normal teenage boy to ignore. Of course, that was only if these teenage boys weren't Lionel Morales. The two guards had pale violet skin and twin horns that came out from their seemingly delicate foreheads. As though that wasn't enough to complete the picture, they both had thin, devilish tails. No matter how one looked at it, these two were a pair of succubi. Lionel couldn't imagine how Mordred thought to receive good quality protection from these two. Lionel looked toward Aina and back before clearing his throat. "Hello, I'm Lionel." Mordred asked to see me. Lionel rarely felt awkward socializing with others, but this was simply too much. Was this how he should be asking to see a demon empress that was feared by so many? Why did it sound like he was checking in at a doctor's appointment? Ah. The two demon women looked toward one another, seemingly communicating about whether they should be attacking now or not. Luckily, large doors off to the side of the quiet room suddenly opened, revealing the figure of a voluptuous woman with pale skin. It seemed as though the only hint of color on her body were her red lips. As for everything else, they seemed painted in black and white. Who else could this person be if not the demon empress Mordred? Mordred smiled, opening her soft lips to speak. But she suddenly paused when she noticed Aina, her lashes fluttering as she blinked, a curious light in her eye. Looking from Aina to Lionel then back, a sudden amused light colored her eyes. Lionel and Aina, correct? Lionel was stunned for a moment, then he remembered that Mordred had seen his life from start to end like he had hers. Even though this Aina didn't match up to his memories, with some context clues and an intelligent mind, it wasn't much of a problem to draw the proper conclusion. Lionel smiled. Demon Empress. Mordred giggled. You don't have to call me that, just call me Big Sis or M. Lionel coughed lightly. M it is, then. Mordred only laughed more at this reaction. Come with me, they'll show you to some accommodations. I might as well act as a proper host. Mordred left with Lionel and Aina under the stunned gazes of the two female demons. Was this really their demon empress? All right, you two can have this room. After traveling through what Lionel could only describe as a dreary and dark castle styled after Earth's Victorian era, Mordred finally stopped at yet another massive door. This castle had a severe lack of normal-sized doors. All the ones they had come across to this point were 10 meters tall at the smallest and all had elaborate archways. Seeing this door, however, Lionel began coughing again. Just one room? Mordred sent Lionel a glance as though she was looking at an idiot. Even if someone was going to say that, shouldn't he have waited for Aina to speak first? Who was the real man in this relationship? Aina didn't say much as she walked into the room, leaving Mordred staring at Lionel and shaking her head in disappointment. Lionel went to scratch his head out of habit, but accidentally interrupted the nap of the little mink. In return, he received a strong swipe that left his hand aching. Mordred pursed her lips and shook her head. Big Sis knows a lot about getting women. Stop being a pansy. Lionel watched as Mordred walked away, completely speechless. How was he a pansy? In fact, he sometimes felt he was a little too bold. How many people would confess so many times? Maybe that wasn't so much of a good thing. Lionel coughed silently to himself. If one had followed him for the last day, they'd probably assume he had a cold of some sort. Lionel walked into the room after Aina, his head swirling with confusing thoughts. Was he really a pansy? Have a nice rest. Mordred's voice came from the hallway. We can talk about the rest tomorrow morning. Lionel felt the door lightly click behind him. He didn't need to think to know that this was Mordred taking action again. The first thing he saw was a massive bed. It was at least 3 meters in width and 5 in length. It was covered with a canopy that partially hid the other details at the same time. The colors of the room were quite warm and much less bland than the rest of the palace. Mostly deep reds, violets and blues. It was quite easy on the eyes. A light scent of roses hung in the air. It wasn't too overpowering, but definitely not subtle either. All in all, it felt like a meticulously sculpted room, for a couple. Aina didn't seem to react much to this. She simply walked to the master bathroom and locked the door behind her, leaving Lionel to his own thoughts. By the time she walked out half an hour later, Lionel was still standing in the same spot, trying to understand. After a while, he looked up and smiled. "Need help drying your hair again?" Hearing these words, Aina blushed slightly, thinking about the last time. But in the end, she still nodded. Chapter 423. The next morning, Lionel and Aina entered the Demon Empire's war room. Compared to the sweetness of the past day, the atmosphere was much tenser. In fact, even Mordred's playful attitude had completely vanished. She sat upon a chair with a tall back, staring intently at a massive map before her. It detailed everything about Camelot and the Demon Empire, even down to the smallest and most inconsequential rivers and hills. Mordred was so lost in her own thoughts and worry that she didn't even notice the arrival of Lionel and Aina. Others of her empire might have been more enthusiastic about their odds, but Mordred had personally seen Lionel's memories. She knew exactly what kind of monster she was facing. She never knew that it was possible to wield such power without magic or internal strength, but now she could no longer deny the possibility. The number one demon Lord Krakos and the other demon lords sat around the massive map, all of them equally as silent. Even though they thought they were in a great position to defend, especially when the demon beasts and the mountainous landscape were taken into account. However, they were all influenced by the emotions of their demon empress and didn't dare to say much of anything. It was only after the doors clicked closed behind Lionel and Aina did some begin to notice their presence. Mordred looked up, squeezing out a smile. But it was clear to all that this was the last thing she wanted to be doing. She knew exactly how dire the situation was, and she also knew that it would be even more dire if others didn't understand the kind of threat they were facing. If even the demon lords didn't quite believe her, then what about their subordinates? And the subordinates to their subordinates? The more carefree and careless an army was, the easier it would be for them to collapse. By the time they realized that these things should be taken seriously, it would all already be too late. This was honestly the largest part of the reason Mordred had no choice but to call for Lionel's help. The only one she could think of that might have a way of turning around this mentality was Lionel himself. Mordred brought Lionel and Aina to sit by her. 3 days ago an envoy of the Ascension Empire came. They established relations and also made it clear that the only course of action was surrender and complete obedience or war. Mordred briefly explained. Lionel nodded. He wasn't sure what he as a single person could do about this. Honestly, he felt that it might be better for the Demon Empire and Camelot to simply surrender. In his opinion, they didn't stand a chance. However, he also understood how hard such a truth would be for them to swallow. No one would like the idea of something they built with their own hands being taken away by another just because. In truth, no one was in the wrong. It wasn't Camelot's fault for appearing within Earth's territory, nor was it Earth's fault for wanting their territory to be under the sole control of themselves. You don't have to do too much during this meeting, Mordred continued. I only want your opinions on certain things. Though I have a small understanding of the kind of existence the Ascension Empire is, I can't be as certain as you. Now that she thought about certain things, Mordred began feeling somewhat guilty about calling Lionel here. Was she asking him to betray his people? Or, even worse than that, had she brought a seed of this empire she wanted to repel into her den? Though Mordred thought these things, she trusted her gut feeling. And, most importantly, she trusted what she had seen from Lionel's life. She knew exactly how he felt about the empire. In fact, he probably hated it even more than she did at this current point. Lionel nodded again. So Mordred wanted a consultation of sorts. This was easy enough to accomplish. Lionel took a back seat, silently listening to the meeting as they began to debate strategy. But, the more Lionel listened, the more his brow furrowed. Their thinking was too strict, their scopes were too narrow, their understanding of their enemy was far worse than Lionel believed the Empire's understanding of them was. The more he listened, the more Lionel came to realize where Mordred's feelings of unease came from. If things continued like this, let alone repelling the Empire, their demon empire would collapse in a matter of a few days. Then, soon after, Camelot would follow. I suggest we leave Serpent's Path unguarded. We only have a limited amount of resources and the enemies aren't fools. Who would march an army up that Hell's Cape? It would be a waste of resources, indeed. Other than leaving some scouts there in case of trouble, I think we can leave it be and focus out defenses elsewhere. Just as the next demon lord wanted to chime in, a sudden sigh sounded. Lionel stood, placing his palm on the map on the table. His eyes closed as he imprinted it all in an instant. Then, his force surged, calling forth a strong surge of earth elemental energies. In the blink of an eye, the landscape bloomed. Under the astonished gazes of all those present, a perfect representation of the map was created, even down to the smallest imperfections of the mountain range they currently sat within. This is your world, Lionel said plainly. Lionel's hand waved again, quickly forming another landmass. But, this one hovered above, held there by Lionel's force. Bang! Lionel dropped the newly created landmass on the one he had just formed. His actions caused a sigh of pity to spread throughout the room. The three-dimensional construct had really been too perfect. After lamenting it for a while, the demon lords looked at the new landscape, their eyes colored with shock. This new structure had such elaborate mountain structures that it put them to shame. Compared to the mountain range of their demon empire, it was like an adult versus a newborn. This is just half a continent on Earth that was once called Asia. Lionel continued just as emotionlessly. The pupils of the demon lords constricted. Just half a continent was already larger than their entire world? Just how big was Lionel's world? Looking at the ease this Asia flattened their lands with, a bit of trepidation crawled into their hearts. When the Ascension Empire had yet to unite all of Earth, Asia was the final continent that remained standing. This wasn't only because of their intelligence and ingenuity, but most importantly because of their terrain, the centerpiece of which was a country once known as China. China is surrounded by sea and islands from one side and completely protected by endless mountains from another. Attacking them was almost impossible and most attempts ended up in failure. Do you know what the Ascension Empire did? Lionel asked coldly. The demon lords shivered, their hearts clenching before Lionel's gaze. They lost focus on who was the human and who was the demon for a moment. Lionel lifted a finger, causing a small ball of fire to appear. It was only the size of a fingernail, but the heat concentrated on it made all of their hearts beat wildly. Lionel flicked his finger toward his construct of ancient Asia. Bang! A hole was blown through the mountains, flattening them to the ground. The demons shuddered. Was this power a civilization should have? How could it be possible to flatten mountains so large? However, the next words Lionel spoke made them all freeze. It was as though a reaper had grabbed onto their throats, suffocating them from the depths of their souls. This happened in 2097, just the 21st century. It's currently the 25th century. What do you think they can do now? Chapter 424. Lionel's words caused an eerie silence to overwhelm the war room. Much like Mordred before, these demon lords had never been aware that there could be power outside one's own bodily strength. Even mages who might as well be known as the nukes of the battlefield in their world couldn't even compare. But, to hear that this was not only possible, but had been possible over 300 years ago by the very same society aiming for their lands now caused many of them to pale. At this moment they were no longer the demons that terrorized the lands of Camelot. They looked toward one another, not missing the trepidation in each one of their eyes. Then, what should we do? How do we beat such an existence? The number one demon Lord Krakos finally spoke, his deep rumbling voice filling the once silent environment. Lionel raised his palm from the table, causing the earth elemental force to disperse. After a moment of silence, he shook his head, causing their hearts to sink. The Empire is more powerful than you could imagine. If it wasn't for the restrictions the metamorphosis placed on them, even destroying your entire world wouldn't be an issue. Lionel's words weren't exaggerated in the slightest. Even back during the start of the 20th century, Earth already had technology capable of wiping out cities. By the end of the 21st, they were able to wipe out whole mountain ranges. Now, as they neared the end of the 25th century, destroying a moon wasn't a matter of if they could, but only if they were willing to pay the price and deal with the aftermath. I don't want to sell you all a false dream. Though I have a strong dislike for the Empire, I also know that I must be realistic. As much as I would like to paint you a pretty picture, the odds of you winning aren't close to zero, they are zero. In fact, though it might be hard to hear, I wouldn't be surprised if the Empire was using your world as a training field for their youth. The atmosphere only grew colder the more Lionel spoke. If you want my suggestions, in my humble opinion you only have a few options. The first is to fight back. Inevitably, you will lose. Once that happens, everyone in this room will be sent to Dark Cloud Prison to live out the rest of your lives. Your citizens will be assimilated into the Empire and become people of Earth. Your second option is to form an alliance with Camelot. Should you do that, you might repel a first wave. But, inevitably, you will lose. Once that happens, everyone in this room will be sent to Dark Cloud Prison to live out the rest of your lives while your citizens are assimilated. Your third option is to display your usefulness. If you manage to do this, it's very possible that you can gain a hereditary title in exchange for your knowledge. If you use proper hard and soft tactics, you may allow your world to be recognized as the 10th province of Earth. The room fell into silence. Lionel didn't mince his words in the slightest. He needed them to understand that this was an impossible war to win. Aina sent a glance toward Lionel's side profile, lost in her thoughts. She wondered just how much of Lionel's words were his own objective analysis and how much of it was the indoctrination he had received since his youth. Where had all of Lionel's knowledge of the strength of the Empire come from? Wasn't it all from his education? Hadn't that education all been provided for, catered, and censored appropriately at the behest of the Empire? Maybe even Lionel wasn't sure about this. All he knew was that he was speaking the truth from his own vantage point and that he didn't feel like he was lying. But, when it came down to it, did those that had been manipulated always realize when they had been? The demon lords looked toward one another. At the same time, Mordred fell into her own thoughts as well. What was the reason she built the demon empire? Other than the fact she had become a tool for the machinations of S.H.I.E.L.D. cross-stars, it was because she hated the fact that she was ostracized by even her own parents simply due to her affinity. Since they hated her dark element so much, she would become the spearhead for people like her and point her blade toward Camelot. However, from what Mordred understood about Lionel's world, the same stigma against the dark element didn't exist. It wasn't an overly religious society, it didn't have a church to worry about, and the most important case was Lionel who stood right before her. Lionel didn't care about the light or dark element one way or another. To him, it was simply something reserved for fairy tales. If she thought about things this way, then what reason did she have to continue protecting this empire? If a society that accepted her appeared, then maybe she could finally rest her head and place down this burden. Lionel, do you believe that demons would be accepted? Mordred spoke, her voice slightly weary. Lionel looked back toward the demon empress, his expression somewhat surprised. He hadn't expected for them to accept this change so quickly. Truthfully, as long as Mordred spoke, the deed was practically half complete. I can't be certain of this either. But, what I do know is that there are people all over Earth awakening abilities that make them look no different from you all the time. The Empire, if it was ever good at anything but conquering and control, has always been diligent in assimilating those of all races without discrimination. But, at the same time, this is a new world. It's somewhat easier to accept others of the same species as opposed to a completely new people like the demons. Still, I ultimately think it's worth a try. Mordred fell into her thoughts for a long time before she finally spoke again. Will you lead these negotiations, Lionel? Lionel raised his brows in surprise. But, in the end, he slowly nodded. Chapter 425. Lionel agreed to Mordred's request, but there were a few things he knew had to be done first. The first was to contact Camelot. It was impossible to accomplish this without putting up a united front. Camelot and the Demon Empire had to come together. Of course, Lionel got a lot of pushback about this. But he had to speak reason to them all. The Empire would never allow civil war within its borders. One way or another, the two would have to assimilate. The question was whether or not they'd act first and get something out of it, or if they'd wait to get conquered and receive nothing in return for their grievances. When Lionel explained it this way, they managed to calm down somewhat and listen to reason. It was only at this point that Lionel realized the demons seemed to hate humans as much as humans hated them. While humans thought demons were bloodthirsty creatures who shouldn't be allowed to be a part of normal society, demons believed humans to be hypocrites that hid their true nature, only to reveal themselves to be far worse than the demons they hated so much. Lionel's second suggestion was to present a shot of strength to the Empire. Negotiations were only possible for those with strength. If there was too large of a power imbalance, what would be the point? The one with the stronger fist would simply take what they wanted. Even though it was clear that the Empire was by far the strongest between the two parties, they still had to put in some effort to level out the playing field. Only then would they be able to open up negotiations in good faith. In the end, these talks boiled down to one fact. Mordred would have to take a trip back to Camelot. Noah looked up from a map he was seriously observing, his expression colored with surprise. You said they sent someone? They want to negotiate? Jessica stood before Noah with her usually cold expression, relaying the information she had just received. Yes. Their number 9 demon lord made a trip down the mountain to relay this message. According to what he had to say, the Demon Empire was willing to open negotiations and want to understand more about what it would mean to submit. Noah raised an eyebrow. Are they trying to stall for time? They arranged for the negotiation to occur in half a month. I have a hard time believing that they could prepare anything in this time. In addition, half a month was the time frame we set for our first wave attack to begin as well. Noah nodded. He found all of this to be curious. From the information they had compiled, the demons were most definitely not such a race. They were incredibly fond of battle and blood. Something like surrendering before a single bullet had been fired was baffling. Could it be that there was someone leading them? Their empress should be a human from Noah's understanding. Maybe it was her who helped them see reason. Noah had never considered negotiations, not because he was opposed to it, but rather because there were some cultural barriers that couldn't be crossed with simple words. Instead of convincing Camelot how powerful they were, it was best to just show them. This would make everything much easier. Interesting. Noah mumbled. He fell into his own thoughts, a familiar aura enveloping his surroundings. Jessica stood silently, her small hands gripping a clipboard. We will accept their meeting, but continue the preparations just in case. We also need a proper display of force to set the tone for the negotiations. I will contact Imperial Grandfather to understand what our bottom line is. Jessica nodded and took Noah's silence as a tacit dismissal. Mordred never thought there would be a day she would return to Camelot. The heavy rain falling against its tall stone walls seemed to be a reflection of her heart. At the very least, she thought that when she returned, it would be as a conqueror. But the truth was that she never expected to do such a thing. If she wanted to overrun Camelot and destroy it, it was likely that she could have succeeded long ago. The only thing that had kept the humans safe all this time was the disorganization of the demons. Mordred was the very person who fixed this fundamental issue, yet Camelot had still yet to be conquered. What reason could there possibly be for this if not a hidden softness within her heart? Mordred silently gazed upon Camelot's gates. Compared to how things usually were, the massive capital city was quite quiet. Ever since this endless torrential rain began, a dark fog had been hanging over their world as though everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. The appearance of the Empire just so happened to be that other foot. Lionel watched silently from Mordred's side. To this negotiation, only he, Mordred, Aina and Krakos had come. Even if things went horribly wrong, Lionel was still confident in taking everyone out safely. Now, it was just a matter of Mordred taking that final step forward. After gathering herself, Mordred took a step forward. But what she hadn't expected was for a woman in a fluttering blue dress to suddenly appear before the gates. The only one who didn't seem shocked by this was Lionel himself, who had long since grasped the energy fluctuations. And it was even easier to understand after he recognized the woman to be Queen Guinevere. Mordred never reacted when she saw her father. In fact, even with Lionel's senses, he would have never guessed that King Arthur was her father without having seen Mordred's life from start to end. But the moment this woman appeared, Mordred froze. Tears flowed uncontrollably from Guinevere's eyes. Still, as though she was trying to respect Mordred's personal space, she didn't get any closer than a few meters. It seemed that the reason there was no one to receive them was because Guinevere had insisted on doing it herself. For some reason though, Lionel felt as though the energy of this world suddenly shifted when mother and daughter stood face to face. He couldn't quite grasp it, but he felt as though a small shackle had unlocked. This meeting might be far more important than even Lionel knew. Sparks flew within Lionel's dreamscape. But, once again, there wasn't enough information to draw the final conclusion. Chapter 426. Lionel felt a complex swell of emotions when he saw Guinevere. Those eyes. That day when he fell into an illusion of dream force, causing his long-forgotten memories to resurface, he had seen them before. Mordred wasn't sure what to say or do. She wasn't nearly as emotional as Guinevere, but she also wasn't indifferent. She was caught in an odd in-between, a mixture of awkwardness and hesitancy coloring her usually confident, womanly demeanor. Guinevere shook her head, seemingly realizing that she had lost control of her emotions. She quickly composed herself, her tears drifting away from her cheeks in a magical sort of way. But there was nothing she could do about the redness of her eyes. They acted like a constant reminder of the emotions she had just displayed. "Welcome to Camelot, please come with me." The queen bowed lightly, regaining a professional air. However, anyone who knew about diplomatic relations between countries, kingdoms, or empires would be wholly aware that something like a monarch bowing to another would never happen. Such a thing would be like a power admitting its inferiority to another. It was clear that Guinevere wasn't a fool who didn't understand these simple and obvious customs. She acted not only out of emotion, but also so that she could let Mordred and the others know that she would stand by them. To Guinevere, in comparison to the kingdom, her daughter was worth far more. It didn't matter to her that Mordred was already a woman of over 40 years old. To a mother, her daughter would always be her little girl. Guinevere rose from her bow, her back straightening to exude the elegance of a queen. With a light smile, she turned and began to lead them all forward. From her back view alone, one could sense her strength and resolve. Mordred blankly stared at her mother's back for a long time. She had expected either cold indifference or a flood of apology. But she ended up receiving neither. And, somehow, this put her more at peace than anything else ever could. "Empress." Krako's deep voice snapped Mordred out of her stupor. "Yes." Mordred nodded and moved forward, her gait steady and even-paced as she followed after her mother. Lionel was about to move to follow as well when he suddenly realized that Aina hadn't moved from start to finish. Aina stood in a daze, her fists clenched. She had come here to battle, she had never expected for things to boil down to a negotiation, and she had definitely not expected to run into such a scene. Her heart beat uncontrollably. She felt as though she wanted to scream out from the depths of her soul. How much had she wanted to see such a look? Would her mother also look at her like this if she was alive? Or would she run off like her father had? Her petite frame began to tremble. Her body held so much power in it. Even now, a massive, curved package was attached to her back. Maybe even Lionel would struggle to carry it with such ease. Yet, at this moment, she couldn't seem to control this powerful body of hers at all. Aina suddenly felt a large hand slip over hers. She looked up to find Lionel smiling toward her. Her heart didn't calm down for a long time, but she didn't push Lionel's hand away. She lost herself in the size and warmth of his hand. Though his body might have been almost as tough of a pseudo-fourth-dimensional metal, his skin still carried the security only a human's could give. It was only several breaths later that Aina caught her breath and pulled her hand away, slight blush on her features. Lionel smiled. "Let's go." Aina almost imperceptibly nodded and followed along. For the second time in his life, Lionel entered Camelot's castle. But, this time he didn't feel the same awe he had the first time. If anything, it all felt somewhat superficial and weak to the current him. He wasn't sure if this was because he had seen through King Arthur's real character now or if it was something else. But, regardless of the reason, the feeling was quite freeing. Lionel sent a glance toward Aina, who seemed to be looking around curiously. It seemed that despite the fact this was her first time, she didn't seem very affected by it all at all. Toward this, Lionel couldn't help but smile. Aina always acted so shy, but when it came down to it, she was quite a bold woman. Lionel felt that the dichotomy made her so very interesting. Though Aina always blushed profusely when he confessed, whenever they were interacting normally, she didn't seem off-put by him at all. In fact, she had always been the only one who seemed to ignore how serious he got when he took tests or exams. What? Aina looked toward Lionel, realizing that he was looking toward her. Lionel grinned. "Nothing, you just look nice." In return for his flattery, Lionel received a glare. "Be more serious, we're almost there," she said softly. Lionel felt a tingling sensation in his back hearing her voice. He swore Aina's various inflections were a lethal weapon. He didn't know if his compliment made her reply softer, but what he did know was that it was foul play. Seeing that Lionel was in a daze, Aina tugged on his robes and pulled him forward. The others had long since entered the meeting room. Lionel smiled lightly and let Aina pull him along. When they entered the space, they found a well-furnished royal court. There was a throne at the head and a long narrow walkway that splintered off into several seating arrangements. There were, obviously, reserved seating for Mordred, Lionel, and the others. But, what was surprising was that there was another set of reserved seating. In fact, this reserved seating was already filled. The moment Lionel and Aina's gazes swept through the room, their killing intent erupted at the same time. The already silent room was suddenly infused with the rage of two. The familiar red hair and red eyes could never be mistaken. It was a member of the Brazinger family. Chapter 427. When King Arthur saw Lionel walk in, he of course felt a complex swirl of emotions. For better or worse, he felt an even more visceral reaction than when he saw his daughter. But, maybe that made sense. After all, Arthur had clashed with Mordred many times before. It wasn't as though this was the first time he was laying eyes on his daughter in years. In comparison, Lionel was like a beacon that awakened him in many ways. Of course, that was most exacerbated by the death of 6 of his brothers, but Arthur still felt that the initial catalyst was Lionel himself. However, what Arthur hadn't expected was for Lionel to suddenly erupt with such killing intent the moment he stepped into the royal court. At first, Arthur thought that this rage was aimed toward himself. But, he very quickly realized that from start to finish, Lionel had only swept a cursory glance over him. It was complete disregard, the very same disregard he felt when Lionel strolled out of his kingdom without even attempting to hide his tracks. Arthur couldn't help but feel an anger well up in his chest. As much as a person wanted to change, it was too difficult for a person to flip on a dime. It often took years of constant effort to undo what it took years to ingrain in the first place. But, Arthur very quickly realized that this had nothing to do with him. At that moment, a man with blazing red hair and eyes just as crimson frowned, looking up to find the fury Aina and Lionel were looking at him with. But, in truth, he was quite confused. He didn't know who these 2 kids were at all. This member of the Brazinger family wasn't the only one who had come. By his side, there was a blonde and golden-eyed man. And, by this person's side there was a green-haired and green-eyed woman. The last person was another than Lionel would recognize. A blue-haired and blue-eyed man by the name of Matthias Aderna. He was the very same man who had led little Nana and the others into the Camelot zone. Now it seemed like he was back for whatever reason. However, Lionel didn't spare him a single glance. His palm had already flipped over, revealing a bow that exuded a deathly sharp aura. He immediately locked onto the red-haired man, causing the latter's expression to darken even further. Lionel. Arthur panicked slightly. He didn't understand what Lionel was doing and for what purpose. It was obvious that Lionel had some sort of animosity with this red-haired man, but was it really so bad to take such immediate action? Unfortunately, Lionel didn't even look in Matthias' direction, leaving him quite stunned. Much like Arthur, he thought that Lionel might have some animosity toward him as well, but the reality was likewise outside of his expectation. The little mink reacted just as violently. Jumping from Aina's arms, it found its spot at the top of Lionel's head, its fur standing on end. Lionel! Arthur roared, standing from his throne. Even though Arthur was even somewhat thankful for Lionel, he couldn't allow a diplomat sent by another nation to be killed in his royal court. At least, this was how he saw those four. Regardless of what reason Lionel had, he couldn't allow him to act on them. Lionel flipped another palm. As though he couldn't hear Arthur at all, he knocked an arrow, his senses locking onto the red-haired man. It was only now that the man began to feel some pressure. He stood from his seat, his heart thrumming. But, this wasn't out of fear. He simply activated his lineage factor, feeling his blood course through his body as he raised his strength to its optimal levels. He didn't know why Lionel was targeting him, but he didn't care. He wouldn't allow himself to be killed even if there was a good reason. Lionel. Compared to the other voices calling out his name, this was by far the softest. Yet, it was the only voice capable of making Lionel's aura completely disperse. Lionel looked over and down toward Aina, only to find her having regained her calm. She stood there, shaking her head. "We came here to help Em, don't ruin things." Lionel's brow furrowed when he heard this. That was right. If he killed someone here, even if he had a good argument, it would be difficult to persuade Arthur to their side. Even though Guinevere was on their side, if her word was really final, Mordred wouldn't have been ostracized in the first place. With what Lionel knew about King Arthur, he was already unlikely to agree with their proposal to begin with. If he didn't something to push him further away, things would only become more difficult. Lionel's arm relaxed slightly, his gaze coldly locking back onto the red-haired man as he lowered his bow. Without a word, Lionel put his bow away and made his way to his seat. After taking his eyes off the red-haired man, he didn't look his way again as he tried to calm the raging tide that was his blood. But, a heavy aura hung around him. Aside from Aina, who seemed unaffected, everyone else was, making it difficult for them to begin discussions. A heavy silence hung over royal court. Many gazes were on Lionel, trying to figure out the reason for his previous outburst, yet the subject of their observation sat silently staring in no particular direction. However, judging by the look in his eye, it felt as though he could lash out again at any time. King Arthur's face went cold as he sat back down on his throne. It hadn't escaped his notice that his wife hadn't sat by his side and had instead chosen to sit by Mordred. And now, Lionel had completely disregarded him. It felt as though this throne he sat on was weightless. What the hell had he spent his whole life building? Was it really all meaningless? Chapter 428. A silence continued to hang over the royal court. For a while, it seemed as though no one would speak at all until it was that King Arthur finally composed himself, regaining his bearing. Today it seems that two parties have come to negotiate terms with our Camelot, one of which was more of a surprise than the other. Arthur began to speak, sweeping a gaze over the hidden families. Though the appearance of Mordred and the others was planned, these hidden family members appeared out of nowhere. However, after hearing that they were a power that could oppose the Empire, Arthur became intrigued and allowed them to enter. He couldn't be certain of what Mordred's purpose here was, but as an intelligent man and a ruler with many years of experience, he could make a good guess. Initially, even though he was unwilling, he thought that he might have no choice but to accept Mordred's propositions, especially with the current actions of his wife, but the appearance of this third party left him feeling pleasantly surprised. It seemed that King Arthur was still unwilling to relinquish his power. As much pain and suffering as this throne had brought him, wouldn't it make all that hardship meaningless if he were to just give it up now? Matthias cleared his throat, trying to settle the atmosphere down. He sent a side glance toward the red-haired man before he opened his mouth to speak. Yes. We came here today to encourage Camelot not to fall prey to the intimidation of the Empire. Though we won't deny that they are powerful, what we can say is that they are not the only ones who are so. This universe is very big and its scope is endless. In the grand scheme, the Ascension Empire is just a speck of dust floating in the winds. King Arthur and the other court ministers were quite intrigued by these words. This concept of a universe was one they had never heard of before. Yet, it was a word that filled them with awe and thoughts of grandeur. Before, they hadn't even been aware that a world outside their own existed, but now they were learning about so much more. Among these ministers were a few characters Lionel recognized, namely Lancelot and the young Prince Lyones. Neither had participated in the Merlin trials, so they were of course very safe. From their facial expressions, it was difficult to tell what they were thinking. But the two sat on complete opposite sides of the room, not interacting with one another. Your words are quite honey-coated, King Arthur said with a laugh. But, what does the vastness of this universe have to do with us? If anything, it might be safer to have a sturdy wing to take cover beneath, don't you think? Even though King Arthur didn't mean these words, he still spoke them. He wasn't a fool. Negotiation was about leverage, and why would he give up his own so easily? Matthias smiled lightly at these words. Clearly he was very much expecting them. To answer your question, I think we should give a bit of background on Earth itself. The Empire might be considered the main power beneath the sun, but it is only that. Within the shadows, there are several other rivals to it. For one, there is the Slayer Legion that the Empire has not been able to weed out all this time. And, with the descent of the Metamorphosis, the Slayer Legion is only growing more powerful. However, I would say that the true hidden strength of Earth would be us so-called hidden families. I don't particularly like this term. Rather than saying that we are hiding, it's more accurate to say that there hasn't been anything worth coming out for just yet. I can swear that if our families were to come out now, this so-called Ascension Empire would have no chance of survival. Matthias' words were forceful and full of pride. However, King Arthur only shook his head after hearing them. You've spoken many niceties and painted a picture in very broad strokes. However, you have yet to speak of how these things could help our Camelot. What difference is there in submitting to you versus this Ascension Empire? Though you say you are more powerful, these are just your words. How can we take them just as you said them? Matthias smiled. I will give you proof then. Are you aware of the dimensions? King Arthur frowned. This was a concept that had been foreign to him until the envoy of the Ascension Empire had come. It was only after that he learned about these ranking systems. Seeing Arthur's reaction, Matthias' smile deepened. The Ascension Empire is the ruler of a pseudo-fourth-dimensional world. Even after Earth breaks through once again, their power will still ultimately be considered to be within the third dimension. In fact, the truth is that their strength will diminish by several factors after the descent of the fourth dimension is complete. King Arthur and the court ministers frowned. How could that be so? You all may not believe me, but the true backbone of the Ascension Empire is their technology. However, upon ascending dimensions, the physics by which their technology is built upon is distorted, changed, and flipped. This means that staples of their understanding will be overturned, thus making their technology useless. In fact, even in this pseudo-fourth-dimensional world, they are already holding on by a thin thread. They only manage to use some of their prowess with a stopgap measure like their force disruption towers, but these towers have no chance of working against true fourth-dimensional force. That being the case, what do you think will happen once the fourth dimension descends? They'll essentially be a crippled power having lost their main source of strength. Matthias' smile only seemed to widen the more he spoke. And, do you know what the best part about all of this is? Normally, it would take another decade or two for the first stage metamorphosis to complete. However, due to the appearance of your world, the timeline has been accelerated. By now, there's already less than a year left. Arthur's gaze sharpened, his eyes narrowing. If this was true, our proposal is simple. Matthias began to hammer in the final nails. We will protect you all until the metamorphosis concludes. Unlike the Empire, we hidden families aren't restricted to third-dimensional entities, and we aren't fools who place our hope in garbage like technology. Once the fourth dimension descends, that bottleneck that has been keeping you and your warriors and mages from advancing all these years will break. Then, not only will you grow stronger, but the Empire will grow weaker. By then, you'll be on the same playing field as the rest of us. And the catch? Arthur asked with a raised eyebrow. It couldn't be simpler. Matthias said slowly. All we ask for is an exchange of knowledge. Your world's magic system, we would like to learn it. Arthur and the other ministers fell into silence. These conditions. They were very good. Mordred clenched her jaw, her gaze icy. She didn't spare a glance toward her father in the slightest. She wasn't surprised by the fact he would make a decision before even hearing her speak. It wasn't as though he had never disregarded her before. Are you done now? A sudden voice cut through the silence. Unexpectedly, it was the very same Lionel that had been the center of attention previously. Chapter 429. Lionel wasn't particularly angry at Matthias. Other than the time he ordered little Nana to bind him, an action that almost cost him a spot to enter the zone, his interactions with the man hadn't been all too bad. In fact, Matthias had even extended an invitation for him to join the Aderna family. The issue here was that Lionel wasn't in a very good mood. And, having to listen to Matthias spin a fanciful tale Arthur and the others just gobbled up left him even angrier. Compared to the Empire, Lionel hated the hidden families several times more. Even if it wasn't Aina in particular that had suffered at their hands, he would be disgusted by their actions. Ostracizing a little girl and her father. Killing that little girl's mother. And for what, exactly? Even to this point, Lionel wasn't exactly sure. But, judging by the fact everyone else of the Brazinger had red hair and eyes while Aina did not, someone as intelligent as him could connect the dots. It was eugenics. Lionel had been surprised to see that all these families had the same eye and hair color initially. But, after a while, he came to understand just why this was. Eugenics was a set of beliefs that ascribed to the idea of maximizing the gene pool quality of a population of people. They did this by massacring those not like them and ensuring marriages between those who could guarantee quality children. There were cases like this in ancient Germany with the Nazis and those with blonde hair and blue eyes. There were cases like this from ancient America with white supremacists. There were cases like this from ancient Africa with. The list seemed endless and each instance was just as heart-wrenching as the last. The practice was sickening. Lionel had this sort of visceral reaction he couldn't even control when he thought about it. He couldn't imagine deciding a person's worth by the way that they looked. One might argue that it was more than skin deep for these hidden families. At least, compared to those ancient civilizations with disgusting practices, there was a tangible benefit to maintaining the purity of these families, that being their lineage factors. However, this didn't change Lionel's mind in the slightest. Hadn't Aina still awakened her lineage factor? Hadn't his two parents still managed to pass down their own to him? And, even if they couldn't, so what? The worth of a person had to be measured by their strength? They couldn't have anything else worthy about themselves? They couldn't have anything else to give? The longer Lionel spent in this new world order, the more it disgusted him and the more that budding feeling inside of him seemed to sprout and germinate. Matthias frowned upon hearing Lionel's words. Kid, Matthias began, though I'm thankful for the things you've done, this is a matter where I must represent all of our hidden families. Even if you'd like to be angry, keep it within. A lack of maturity won't help you in these negotiations. Matthias' words caused many to frown in Lionel's direction. His actions were indeed inappropriate considering the circumstances. Mordred's gaze flashed with a hint of worry before she shook her head and sighed internally. She had already given up on her father. There was no need for Lionel to continue to try to stay within the arbitrary lines of political correctness. Since it wouldn't get them anything regardless, she might as well let Lionel do as he pleased. Lionel nodded. Painting me as a child who's in over my head is a good strategy. Maybe you could have used some of that intelligence before you were captured by Magus Ailiard, or at the very least, you could have used some of your family's so-called great hidden strength. Matthias froze, a hint of rage flashing within his eyes. He had never done anything too wrongful to this child, he didn't know why he was being so hostile. In fact, originally, the red-haired man was supposed to take the forefront and speak. Matthias took over this job to hopefully blunt Lionel's potential aggressiveness. But, what he had never expected was for it all to be meaningless. Lionel acted as though he didn't even recognize him. As expected, the expressions of the court ministers somewhat changed. It was only at that moment that they remembered that it had been Lionel who killed that traitor. In fact, Arthur hadn't recognized Matthias before because he was a puppet under Pope Margrave's control back then, but now that he thought about it, this was indeed that man. In an instant, all the bravado that Matthias had brought forth seemed to crumble. First impressions were everything. If the representation of this Aderna family couldn't even protect his own life without Lionel's interference, then how powerful could they really be? Mordred's eyes widened. Back then, she had been the one to fight the puppets the Aderna family members had become. She had almost forgotten this completely. Compared to Lionel's overwhelming strength back then, they were just average. Of course, that might have been due to the Margrave's puppeteering taking away their strength. But, the fact that Margrave could enslave them at all spoke volumes. The situation is very simple. Lionel continued with a steady voice. Even if everything they said is true, you will still fall before the fourth dimension descends. They're only trying to prey on your ignorance. The hidden families might have higher dimensional beings, but none of them can come to help you. Entering a lower dimensional world from a higher is very difficult. And, even if you manage to accomplish it, you will be forced to deal with all sorts of restrictions. If you aren't a native of the world you descend to, the restrictions are even fiercer. So, at this very moment, these hidden families can only send out strength on the level of them. Lionel swept a glance over the four. At least, on any sort of large scale. Yet, they've said themselves that they don't rely on technology, which means that unlike the Empire, they don't have a method of bridging this gap in strength. But sure. If you want to hand over all your secrets in exchange for protection that won't last more than a week, please have at it. Lionel's voice plainly concluded before starting up again as though he had forgotten something amusing. Oh, and a reminder that I already comprehend everything about your magic system, more than even most in this room, actually. So, you should ask yourselves whether you trust someone who wants something out of you more, or if you'll take the word of someone who's only here to help a friend. Lionel swept a pointed glance over Arthur. His meaning couldn't have been more clear. Will you choose benefits again this time? Or will you choose kinship? Chapter 430. Lionel's words hung over the royal court. They played like an indifferent, systematic dismantling of everything Matthias had tried to build up. It felt almost impossible, yet every single one of his words were pointed and sculpted perfectly. Honestly, it was a far cry from what many of them expected. But, how could they know Lionel's level of understanding when it came to human psychology? In fact, after he finished speaking, he didn't even feel the need to say anything else. He shifted his gaze from King Arthur and fell into silence. It was as though he didn't care about the result at all. He had said his piece, and whether or not Arthur wanted his help would be up to him. From anyone on the outside looking in, it was as though it was King Arthur who had come to Lionel for help rather than the other way around. But, the truth was that in Lionel's mind, it was exactly like this. From Lionel's analysis, Camelot didn't stand a chance if they didn't follow his plans. If they were more fond of being destroyed and losing any semblance of status they once had, then Arthur could feel free to choose against him. At that moment, Guinevere's hand slipped into Mordred's, catching the latter off guard. The demon empress involuntarily trembled and even hesitated as to whether she should pull her hand away. It was just a subtle action. Hardly anyone noticed, in fact. Even in such a silent royal court, the movement didn't make a sound. Still, there were 4 individuals this didn't escape. The young Prince Lioness. The King of Camelot, Arthur. Lionel himself. And, finally, the Knight of the Round Table, Lancelot. Lancelot's reflective blue eyes seemed locked onto the hands of the 2 women. From the outside, there wasn't any change to his expression in the slightest. But in his heart, a wild tsunami of emotions was swirling. Despite what some versions of the fairy tales might write, Lancelot had never shared a bed with Guinevere. As for the awkward interactions between he and Lioness, this was only because Lioness had found out how close his mother and Lancelot were getting and felt uncomfortable by the changes. Lioness held a deep reverence for his father. He hoped to one day be as valiant and have his name resound in the ears of the people just as much as King Arthur did. So, when he stumbled upon his mother having a midnight conversation with Lancelot, his heart, too, was filled with all sorts of complex emotions. He had listened in on their conversation back then for just a few minutes. On the surface, there wasn't anything sinister or immoral about what they spoke about. They conversed about the stars, their day, their hopes for the future. It was an innocent conversation without blemish, one that didn't carry any sense of infidelity in the slightest. But, it was exactly this sort of conversation Lioness had never heard his mother exchange with his father. Despite being young then and still young even now, Lioness felt uncomfortable for reasons he couldn't put his finger on. It only made it worse that the reactions his mother and Lancelot had when they stumbled onto his eavesdropping were riddled with guilt. The 3 of them had a tacit understanding that day that what happened was wrong. Since then, Lioness had hardly spoken to his mother and was incredibly awkward around Lancelot. At the same time, though, he never brought this up to his father either. The truth was that he couldn't decide whose side he was on. Back then, due to how much he worshipped his father, he felt an irrational hatred for his mother, causing him to pull away from her. But, as he grew up, the image of his perfect father also seemed to crack, but by then, it was already too late to grow closer to his mother. Somewhere deep inside, Lioness knew. He knew that his mother had feelings for Lancelot. He knew that Lancelot had feelings for his mother. He knew that both of them knew they were wrong. But, what he didn't know was how he felt about it. Seeing his mother grip his sister's hand in this way, he felt like this was a turning point. The relationship between his mother and father had been growing distant for a long time. He often felt like his birth was meant to mend what they had lost after his elder sister was driven away, but he was never quite able to fill that void. And now they were here. King Arthur's heart beat erratically. Choosing to side with Lionel meant giving up all the power he had ever known. Though Lionel painted a pretty picture, he would have to expel all thoughts of sovereignty he had in his bones. In the future, when he saw those of higher standing than himself, he would have to bow and politely greet them. In the future, when he wanted to direct the movement of his people, he would have to consider the opinions of others and swallow his grievances. In the future, when he swore loyalty to this Ascension Empire, he would have to kneel and lower his head, accepting another man as being his superior. Just thinking about these things tore Arthur apart. He was a legend, a young man who rose up despite not having his parents. He was the chosen heir of Merlin. He was the boy who pulled the sword from the stone. How could he kneel to another? How could he swallow his pride? How could they ask this of him? Arthur's hands trembled, grasping tightly to the arm rests of his throne. At that moment, an audible crack resounded. With a blank look, Arthur looked down to find that his strength had splintered the arm of his throne. For some reason, he couldn't take his eyes off of it. It was like the sound ricocheted throughout his soul. Arthur closed his eyes and sank back into his seat. He seemed tired, his lustrous blonde hair and radiant skin paling by several levels. Camelot will side with the Demon Empire. Chapter 431. Lionel raised his eyebrows, clearly having not expected Arthur to come to a decision so quickly. In fact, the most surprised were those from the hidden families. They had come here with a lot of confidence, and the only reason they hadn't interrupted during the extended silence was to give Arthur some space and respect. Negotiations were meant to be like a game of tug-of-war. A single volley of arguments should have never been enough to close the subject completely. They had expected Arthur to have some back-and-forth discourse with Lionel first before tracking back to them. Then, they could try to rebuttal some of Lionel's views. But, instead of any of that happening, King Arthur shut it all down from the beginning. In fact, he didn't even pause to have a conversation with his court ministers either. He just directly made the decision before them all. It was no surprise, then, that even the court ministers were shocked. The only one that didn't seem to have a violent reaction was Lancelot. He sighed deeply, closing his eyes. He sank back into his chair. "Hold on a moment, King, isn't this too rash?" Matthias' expression changed violently as he stood. "Please reconsider, there are still many matters I've yet to bring to the table. Though what the child said about us is partially true, it is not completely so. Even without technology, we have access to many mystical means far beyond what mere." Arthur rose a hand, his eyes remaining closed. "That's enough. I've understood most things, but my decision remains the same. If you would like to stay as ambassadors to my kingdom, please feel free to do so, we will accommodate you appropriately." Matthias' expression froze. Were things really going to end just like that? How had they lost to a kid who barely spoke a few words? Unfortunately, Matthias didn't really understand the backstory of it all. There were too many versions of the King Arthur story. He was shocked enough that Mordred was a woman, he would have never guessed that she was also Arthur's daughter. These intricacies were all things that Lionel picked up by being front and center within Camelot. Of course, he also got a bit lucky by being placed within the same trial as Mordred as well. But, regardless, these were all things outside of Matthias' grasp. Matthias didn't know what to say or how. Arthur's words were so final that any attempt he made to change them would come off as a sign of hostility. At that moment, Matthias felt a hand grasp onto his shoulder. He turned to find that it was the red-haired Brazinger clan member. "In that case, we will be taking our leave." Arthur nodded lightly and all the energy seemed to drain from him. Under a heavy silence, the 4 hidden family members walked away under the escort of several guards. "Fuck." Matthias blasted a fist print into a thick tree. Despite his strength, the tree hardly swayed. But, that didn't stop bark from flying in every which direction. Though he had hit it well before, Matthias was completely enraged by Lionel bringing up his capture. He had already suffered ample punishment from the family, but to also be berated in public and looked down upon for it, how could he not be enraged? It was no surprise that any one part of the hidden families that could be on Earth currently didn't have very high statuses. The only exceptions to these rules were the youths that had yet to mature. In comparison, Matthias and the others were just glorified babysitters. In order to display a stronger front, the older members were sent to negotiate. But, Matthias had never expected to run into Lionel. Had he known, he would have allowed one of the others to speak even if the red-haired man of the Brazinger family didn't. The flicker of a lighter caught Matthias' attention. He looked over to see the red-haired man lighting up a cigarette. "Those things have been extinct for centuries, Laren. Keep that cancer smoke away from me." Matthias waved his hand, slapping the gray smoke away. The green-haired woman and the golden-eyed man stood to the side, feeling somewhat impatient. They were more peeved about the wasted trip than Laren seemed to be and were wondering why they were standing in a forest instead of returning home. "If you all are just going to stand here, I'm going to leave first." The woman spoke, pulling out a talisman. "Hold on there, Zindi. What's the hurry?" Laren spoke languidly. Zindi sneered. "You seem quite relaxed for a man who was almost killed by a brat." Laren's gaze flashed with killing intent as he swept it over Zindi. "Almost killed by who?" "Stop wasting my time, Laren. Have a good reason for stopping me or I'm leaving right now." Zindi replied without fear. Laren continued to coldly glare at Zindi as though he hadn't heard a word she said. All right. The blonde man stepped in. "That's enough. I'm sure you had a reason for leading us here instead of letting us go home to report this, correct?" The blonde man was known as Amron. His words seemed to hold quite some weight because instead of continuing to glare at Zindi, Laren took another long puff and exhaled slowly. You guys plan to go back and report a failure? Why? So that you can fall even more out of favor? What are you trying to say, Laren? Amaran's gaze narrowed. I'm saying that you're giving up too soon, tucking your tails and running just because a fairy tale character told you no? Laren chuckled, taking another big puff. And what do you want us to do about it exactly? Zindi interjected. Matthias turned an eye toward Laren. Clearly, he was interested as well. Didn't I already give you the answer? Laren smiled slyly. Do you get the impression from them that they understand that they're nothing but a bedtime story? The three's eyes widened as Laren continued. I noticed that Queen Guinevere was quite close to that demon empress in the courtroom. They were even holding hands at the end there like a pair of girl pals. I have a gut feeling that folk tale of a king only made such a decision because he sided with his wife. I wonder how he'd react if he knew, aside from being the legendary boy who pulled the sword from the stone, that he was just as legendary of a cuck. Chapter 432. Arthur stood and walked off, leaving the royal courtroom alone. One would have thought that he would bask in his decision, even try to reconnect with his wife and daughter immediately. Unfortunately, unlike Laren made it seem, this wasn't a fairy tale. People don't change immediately, neither can relationships fractured over several decades be repaired in a day. At this moment, Arthur was feeling quite desolate. Pride was a hard thing to overcome, especially when it was your own. Now, Arthur had to come to grips with the fact that he would not only be handing over something he had worked his whole life to build, but in doing so would have to act like he was grateful. It was a difficult thing for a man to set aside his pride. It was even more difficult for a king to do so. It was difficult to the point where, even though Arthur knew that he stood at a diverging path, one facing his family and the other facing his kingdom, he still found this decision hard to swallow. The royal court remained silent. It was taboo for a king to display such emotion, and this could be the first time any of them had ever seen Arthur like this. Guinevere cast a glance toward Arthur's back, but she hesitated. Her gaze wanted to shift to another place, but she didn't dare to look. Their relationship had never borne any fruit, but Guinevere still felt all sort of complex emotions about it. Guilt, trepidation, but even those were accented by a budding sweetness and a freedom she hadn't felt in a long time. She couldn't help but feel like she had taken advantage of Lancelot's feelings to make herself feel better. Such a thing filled her with a swirl of thoughts she didn't know how to deal with. Your Majesty. Lionel's sudden voice drifted to Guinevere's ears, stunning the queen. She had never interacted with Lionel before, and the start of such communication at this particular moment left her at a loss. If she was honest with herself, though she was grateful to Lionel, he was the last person she wanted to talk to now. However, Lionel's next words shook her to her core. Go speak with him and be as open and honest as possible. Guinevere froze, her hand involuntarily tightening around Mordred's. Mordred, who had, of course, not been expecting this, looked toward her mother. However, she couldn't hear Lionel's words at all. It will be difficult. Lionel continued. However, what Arthur needs the most now is your transparency. When a man loses everything, his family is his only pillar. Guinevere wanted to lash out at Lionel's words. However, she couldn't, not because she didn't have the mind to, but because she couldn't replicate Lionel's silent communication. This left her feeling overly stifled and her breathing even hitched, her grip tightening on Mordred's hand again. She was a queen. Maybe in some ways, the same pride that ran in Arthur's veins ran through her own. But it was even deeper than this. Anyone being confronted about such an intimate matter would react defensively first. This would be the case even if two people were close, let alone if they couldn't have been closer to strangers like Lionel and Guinevere. This, in addition to the fact Guinevere was a woman while Lionel was a man, all added to the fact she was a queen used to an unblemished and polished image. Guinevere felt a mixture of embarrassment, unwillingness, and unending grievances. As if all this wasn't bad enough, Lionel was a kid in Guinevere's eyes. What did he know about being a man? Such words coming from the mouth of a teenage boy felt like a bunch of flowery nonsense without substance. However, Lionel knew he had no choice but to continue to push. When Arthur made his decision, he felt that feeling again, that feeling that something was about to change. Spark lit in his mind, but he had no way of fully connecting them. He had no choice but to act on his instincts and hope for the best. I know that hearing all of this from me fills you with feelings you don't know how to deal with, and I know that communicating with you in this way where you can't respond to me is even more stifling. I can't comfort you with any words outside of this. I only want you to know that I have the best interest of Camelot at heart. Have you wondered why it is I know about these things I shouldn't? Lionel's final question caused Guinevere to freeze completely. All her anger vanished with the wind, a deep trepidation gripping her heart. All I want you to ask yourself is if you would rather him hear it all from your lips? Or find out through the words of another? Guinevere clenched her jaw, her eyes reddening. Mordred's words paused before she finished them. Could she really still call Guinevere mother? She didn't know if she was ready for such a thing yet. But, she had no idea just the start of her words snapped Guinevere back to reality. Guinevere looked toward where Arthur disappeared and back toward her daughter. Mordred, Guinevere was completely flustered. She forgot about how she had addressed Mordred as Demon Empress all this time. A motherly tone involuntarily came from her. However, surprisingly, Mordred wasn't off-put by this. In fact, she seemed to understand something as she smiled lightly. Go. Guinevere's eyes uncontrollably teared. If it wasn't for the court ministers having become lost in their own debates about the changes coming to Camelot, she would have instantly become the center of attention. There were two that did notice though. Her son was the first and the second was Lancelot. Guinevere stood slowly, her hands still wrapped around her daughter's. She looked intently at Mordred as though making sure it was truly all right. She had already abandoned her daughter once, she couldn't stand the thought of doing it again. But, seeing the reassuring gaze Mordred returned her back straightened, a certain determination lighting her beautiful eyes. She released Mordred's hand, a light smile on her face. Back straight, she walked toward the direction her husband left in. From start to finish, she didn't look toward Lancelot. She seemed to be using her actions to convey something profound. But, ultimately, it all led to the broken heart of a knight. Chapter 433. I think I will return now. Mordred said softly, motioning toward Krakos. From start to finish, the number one demon lord hadn't said a word and had simply observed things. Though he received many looks and several auras were constantly locked onto him, the demon lord always remained calm, restraining his own. Lionel nodded lightly. He knew that Mordred had gone through a lot today. The wounds she had suffered in her past couldn't be cured so quickly, but Lionel felt content that they were going in the right direction. He and Mordred practically knew everything about one another. In many ways, Lionel felt that he was closer to her than he had ever been to James. Seeing her slowly coming back to her family left him feeling happy. What's with that smile? Mordred teased. Is Big Sis very beautiful? Lionel coughed, not knowing how to respond. But, his predictable reaction left the Demon Empress giggling. Just as Mordred was about to turn to leave, Lionel suddenly spoke out. Demo, I take you to be one of my close friends now. I just wanted you to know that. Mordred's steps froze, looking back toward Lionel with surprise. Seeing those clear, pale green eyes and that handsome, charismatic smile, she felt her heart shudder. For some reason, she felt her tears well up in her eyes. She quickly dried them with a subtle use of force, not letting them fall. Then, just as quickly as she had almost cried, she smiled a charming smile. Big Sis has more to teach you about women. Rule number 1 is to not make them cry. Mordred strolled away under the escort of several guards, clicking her tongue as though she was still reprimanding Lionel. But, in response, Lionel only chuckled. You must be happy having such a beautiful friend, Ana's voice disrupted Lionel's mood, causing his coughing fit to return. It's fine, I'm pretty sure only likes women anyway. Lionel quickly recovered. So you mean that if she liked men instead you'd be happier? Ah. Lionel had been checkmated once again. He didn't know how all his insane thinking speed and people skills couldn't find him a path out of this. Luckily, he then heard Aina begin to giggle to herself, the soft bells of her laughter warming his heart. He didn't know when Aina got such a teasing side to her. The two sides Lionel knew were either the overly shy Aina or the bloody killer Aina. What he didn't know was that Aina had no choice but to begin teasing Lionel like this. Before, it felt as though Lionel was always the one causing her to be flustered. Getting back at him now made her feel much better. Maybe even Aina herself didn't realize that in order to tease Lionel like this, she had to play into the fact they were a couple. Who knows how she'd react if she realized what her jokes meant. Lionel suddenly sighed, thinking back to Arthur and Guinevere. Do you think we'd ever grow apart like that? He suddenly asked. Aina froze. She hadn't even thought through herself what she felt for Lionel. She didn't even believe she had the time to think of such things now. Being presented so suddenly with such a loaded question left her not knowing what to say for a long time. Is it possible for you to grow distant from me? Aina asked a question back herself. Maybe deep down she was also afraid of such a possibility. Lionel had pursued her so doggedly for years. She couldn't help but admit to herself that she thought he would have given up on her a long time ago. During those days, her best friends were Yuri and Savon. Savon especially used to always say that men were just like that. They loved the chase, but the moment they got something, they would soon grow bored and leave it behind for other things. Though Aina never really took much of her rant seriously, she had to admit to herself that thinking of this might have subconsciously been one of the reasons she also never tried to respond to Lionel. This had left her in a perpetual cycle where she never said yes but also never said no. She never quite understood why Lionel was so infatuated with her. She hadn't been the most beautiful in their school, and now she was even further from that reality thanks to these scars. It was even possible that the reason she hadn't shut down Lionel's line of questioning like she would have usually done was precisely because she could no longer bury her curiosity. However, Lionel's response left her completely shaken. Yes. Yes, I could grow apart from you. Aina couldn't explain it, but she felt as though her whole world was collapsing at that very moment. Her mind swam, her vision even blurring. She hadn't expected a particular answer, but what she absolutely never expected was for a response to be able to flip her world upside down like this. The feeling was so real and undeniable that even she couldn't mistake what it was any longer. It hurt. Like a twisting knife at her heart, it tore her apart. Her vision blurred. But it was hard to tell if it was due to tears or if it was the foggy state her mind had entered. But Lionel continued. That's if and only if you stop trusting me. Aina's breath hitched and hiccuped like she couldn't hear Lionel at all. It felt as though she couldn't breathe enough air, as though there wasn't enough oxygen in the world. Every huff she took felt filled with smoke. Aina. Lionel frowned, gripping onto Aina's hands. In her panicked state, she tried to shake Lionel's arms off her. She used such force that Lionel was almost thrown across the room. But he held onto her tightly, gripping the sides of her face and forcing her to look at him. By this point, Lionel had already put up a light refraction spell. He hadn't expected Aina to react so violently, but the last thing she needed now was to be seen by others. Aina struggled, but Lionel didn't let her slip away. Aina. Lionel's deep, rumbling voice seemed to finally cut deep enough, shaking Aina out of her panicked state. I am a person who severs his emotions easily when I find a logical reason to do so. The only reason it was hard for me to kill for a long time was because I felt my life was worth the same as anyone else's. So, why should I kill them just for me to survive? Sometimes I even fear that one day I really will feel that I am better than others and will no longer have a reason to hold back. However, at the same time, for a very long while, I believed that my mother had abandoned me. Since the day I drew that conclusion, I never thought of her, dreamed of her, or pined after her. The more Lionel spoke, the more Aina seemed to calm down. The rushing tides of her heart slowed to a normal ebb and flow, her breathing slowly returning to normal. Lionel eased his hands away, his gaze becoming much more gentle. I know that you have a heavy burden on your heart. All I want you to know is that I'm here to bear it with you. I just want you to trust me, lean on me. Never go off on your own and do something stupid because I will not come to save you. Do you understand me? Aina's pupils trembled. Where were the words of romance? Where were the talks of running through the fires of hell and smashing the gates of heaven to make it back to her? But, no. These weren't the words that Lionel spoke. As long as you trust me, place your whole faith in me, lean on me like I will lean on you. If you can do this, I swear on my life that I will never leave your side. The tears in Aina's eyes could no longer be held back. They fell like an endless flood. This time, she knew exactly why her vision had blurred. And, maybe it was exactly because her vision blurred that she couldn't react in time. Before she knew what was happening, she felt something hot and heavy press over her lips. Her heart seemed to explode. Feelings she had never felt before kept bubbling forth. Warmth. Sweetness. Anxiousness. As though butterfly wings had spread within her chest, she felt like she was floating on a cloud. Author's note below, December 9, 21. Chapter 434. It wasn't the most romantic kiss as kisses went. In the stories, the couple would be on a hill by a setting sun or beneath the rain and awashed in emotions. But there was no beautiful scenery to be seen. In fact, with a look around, there was nothing but a bland royal court still suffused with a heavy atmosphere. In the stories, maybe some loving words would have just been said. But Lionel had just finished with telling Aina that he had no intention of saving her if she went off and did something stupid on her own. In the stories, the female lead would be gorgeous and flawless. But Aina was still scarred. Even as he kissed her, Lionel could feel the imperfections running across her lips. Still, even with all of this said, Lionel felt as though he was on the top of the world. To veterans of love, Lionel had barely given Aina a peck on the lips. But to him, it felt as though he had conquered the world. It felt better than anything he had ever experienced before. No game he had ever won, no battle he had ever claimed victory in, no complicated thought he had ever finished could match up to the euphoria he was experiencing now. It was only when Lionel sensed his hastily put up, light refraction, spell wavering that he retreated despite his reluctance. However, his actions allowed him to see a scene he would never forget. Aina still sat on her chair, her legs swung in his direction. But her two hands were over her heart, one balled into a fist and the other wrapped around it. They pressed against her chest as though she was trying to stop her heart from escaping. Her lips were slightly separated and trembling, her breathing wild and erratic. A blush traveled up from her neck and through her face, not missing even her trembling eyelids that still hung closed. Though she only remained in this position for a fraction of a moment, Lionel's burned the image into his mind, even down to the way she slightly leaned forward as though subconsciously asking for more. Ah! Aina awoke from her stupor, the flash of crimson across her face and neck deepening by several shades. You. Aina's words stuttered. Lionel grinned like a madman, the deep, rumbling cadence of his heart making his emotions clear. You can't deny that you like me now, right? You. Aina was speechless. She stood up quickly, wanting to run away. But, this time, Lionel grabbed onto her wrist. Don't run anymore. Okay? Lionel's grin faded and his tone softened. Aina's chest heaved, her breath feeling short once again. But, seeing the look in Lionel's eyes made her shudder, a wave of guilt overwhelming her. She took deep breaths, allowing Lionel to lightly hold onto her wrist. She looked down at him from her standing position, her gaze a wild mix of emotions. But, Lionel's own remained steady, like a pillar waiting for her to lean on it. Okay. Aina nodded almost imperceptibly, her voice as quiet as the wings of a butterfly. Lionel smiled. It was no longer a wild grin, but it had a level of peace to it that made Aina almost start shedding tears again. Lionel rose to his full height. The way he almost cast a shadow over Aina made her oddly feel at peace, the erratic beat of her heart finally slowing to a crawl. Lean on me from now on, alright? Aina looked up as Lionel stroked her hair. For some reason, she no longer felt shy or apprehensive. She even felt quite calm. She nodded almost imperceptibly again. For the first time in a long while, Lionel felt relaxed. Standing here like this as though they were in their own world despite everything going on around them felt like a remedy to all that had ailed him. Since the metamorphosis began, he had lost contact with his only family, he had lost his home, he had constantly been on the run or in a perpetual state of battle. Ironically, the first time he truly got any semblance of rest was while he was negotiating for peace on Mordred's behalf. But now, he had found a self-sustaining peace. He felt that no matter where he was or what he was doing, even if he was in the midst of blood and war, as long as she was by his side he would never feel so lost again. You know, people say that all the emotions one put into something never paid off when you truly received it. Athletes spent their whole lives working toward becoming the best of the best, but after winning it all once, it never quite felt the same afterward. The richest men and women in the world devote themselves to growing their net worth to heights still yet unseen, but no matter how much they make, it will never feel as good as the first 100,000 they made. This seemed to just be human nature. Yet, even after Lionel spent 5 years chasing Aina, even as their relationship slowly became closer over the last year, he swore to himself that none of it could compare to this moment. It couldn't be described as a tsunami of emotions but could rather be summarized in a single word: contentment. When Lionel pulled himself out of his languid daze, he grinned once again. You know, we have yet to have our first date as a newly minted couple. Huh? Aina was shocked awake by Lionel's words. She wanted to refute, but couldn't seem to find the words to. She had already promised not to run away any longer, but she was shocked by the sudden labeling of their relationship. Lionel's grin only grew wider. I don't think we should have a normal first date, though. Wouldn't that be too boring? A picnic or a stroll at the park doesn't really suit us, don't you think? Aina raised her brows, her amber irises almost reflecting gold as she looked toward Lionel. She seemed to understand what he was getting at. What better first date for us than a date to kill? Lionel's grin suddenly became somewhat sinister. Chapter 435. Laren, Zindi, Mattias, and Amran still hadn't left. How could they? They were waiting for a proper opportunity. The truth was that although Laren's plan was excellent, executing it would be far more difficult. It wasn't as though they could just plop a bunch of novels and movies in front of King Arthur and expect him to read and watch them all. Whether he even would was one matter, but by the time he did it would probably already be too late. Who cared if Arthur threw a fit after Camelot had already been assimilated by the Empire? By then, they could just send someone to kill him with ease and it wouldn't matter in the slightest. Our best bet is most definitely an illusion specialist. It will be difficult finding one strong enough to cause him to fall, and even more expensive, but it will be worth it. It's the most seamless option we have. The four of them seemed to all agree with this. King Arthur's strength was something they looked down upon initially, until they were in the same room as the man. They couldn't deny the pressure he placed on them, it was undeniable. Not a bad plan. The four were stunned. If these words had been spoken by one of them, it would be fine. The issue was that it most definitely hadn't been. And, to make things worse, they recognized the voice it was spoken by as well. Lionel slowly walked out of the forest, causing the four to be shaken. How had they not heard his approach until just now? That was impossible. Amran's gaze narrowed, his golden eyes piercing toward Lionel. Unfortunately, before they could focus too much on Lionel, another, much louder set of footsteps caught their attention. They spun around, only to find Aina walking forward with a great sword dragging in her hands across the forest floor. Compared to the flustered girl she had been just a while prior, her current cold expression seemed worlds apart. Yip! Yip! A little mink dashed along the tree branches, appearing from a third direction. Lionel, what do you think you're doing? Matthias could no longer hold back his temper. Lionel had already infuriated him enough once, but this blatant provocation was too much for any human to handle. Do you understand what you're doing, kid? Zindi cut in, her green eyes locking onto Lionel. Enlighten me. Instead of taking these words as an opportunity, the four hidden family members only grew more enraged toward Lionel's response. They didn't want to have to explain themselves to a child, and it seemed even more pathetic to do so. Those who had strength didn't need to speak, they could just do. They didn't have to convince anyone of anything. No takers? Lionel almost pouted in disappointment. Truthfully, he was looking forward to learning more about these hidden families. Other than seeing their hair color, he knew nothing else about them. Well, he did know a bit about the Brazinger family's lineage factor thanks to Aina. But, this was about it. Lionel shook his head. I'll give you two options. The first option is to surrender. Allow us to escort you to a holding cell within Camelot until negotiations are complete. After this, we will release you and you can go about your business. The second is to battle. Should you do this, however, you will definitely die. Lionel didn't add any flowery words of encouragement or any coercion in the slightest. He simply laid out the facts as they were. These four had no idea, but they were facing two opponents who had already stepped into the fourth dimension. Not only had Aina done so, but the little mink had done so as well. On top of that, there was Lionel, whose ability was already at the pinnacle of the fifth dimension and was supported by a mind within the fourth. With only four of them, they simply stood no chance. The truth was that Lionel suspected that Amron had already stepped into the fourth dimension. He could tell simply by observing him that he was different from the other three. But, Lionel didn't believe that this would make a large difference. Still, Lionel made a mental note that he needed to understand more about the fourth dimension. Because he didn't have the latter portions of dimensional cleanse, he was flying in the dark about how the power systems of the fourth dimension functioned. As such, he found it difficult to scan the stats of someone within this dimension. However, Lionel's gut feeling told him that the combination of Aina and the little mink was more than enough to deal with this golden-haired man. As for the other three, they were his. So, which choice will you make? Lionel brandished his bow, his demeanor calm and collected. The four began to sweat. This wasn't just a problem of facing the three before them. The main issue was that they were still in enemy territory. Defeating these brats was one thing, but what if Camelot mobilized an army? What would they do then? They didn't feel that these three were stupid enough to come without requesting any sort of backup assistance, right? They couldn't have. Lionel's lip curled into a smile. The most important thing about applying pressure on a person wasn't how much you applied, but when you applied it. If you used all your tactics immediately on a strong-minded individual, they would all fall flat. But, if you simply poked at someone when they were in their most fragile state, they would collapse like a house of cards. Lionel pointed toward the green-haired lady. You have a lineage factor that has great synergy with plants. In your mind, you're probably undefeatable in a forest facing opponents like us, right? You're probably even more confident than a usual member of your family because your ability is a great hardened ability that reinforces the chemical structure of objects to make them tougher than the strongest diamonds and the best alloys. Is that right? Quite a great synergy of your abilities. Would be quite a hassle to deal with a flood of vines all harder than the sharpest swords. Zindi shuddered, the subtle movements she had made to control the vegetation in the surroundings coming to a grinding halt. Lionel's smirk deepened, pointing toward Matthias. And you? Chapter 436. Your lineage factor is quite interesting. A defensive type lineage factor that relies on the fluidity of your body, is that right? Your ability is a C-grade sharpened sight ability that also synergizes well with your lineage factor. I'm sure you're good at hand-to-hand combat, commendable. Lionel spoke with a smile, his demeanor relaxed. There's also you. Lionel continued. Your light elemental lineage factor is quite intriguing, focusing on your attack strength, HM. I'm sure that pairing that with your fifth-dimensional wind elemental ability helps you quite a bit, right? Amaran's gaze narrowed further. Lionel's words had subtly revealed the fact he was quite aware of his strength yet still dared to stand here. Among those here, he was the only one with an ability that touched the realms of the fifth dimension, or so he thought. But now that Lionel was speaking so nonchalantly, he wasn't confident in this matter any longer. Was this brat more dangerous than he originally thought? And you? Lionel's smile faded, his gaze locking onto Laren, the red-haired Brazinger family member. Your lineage factor is related to your blood and your bodily strength. As for your ability, it's of the S grade and only gives you perfect recall of events, is that right? Lionel's cheerfulness had completely vanished. Even as a method of applying pressure, he couldn't stand to continue putting up such a facade for a man from that family. So, what is your choice? Lionel continued coldly. The pressure was palpable. In this world, one of the most protected secrets of a person was their ability. When it came down to a crucial moment, what an opponent did or didn't know about your ability could decide your life and death. The simple truth was that abilities came in all shapes and sizes. And, even if by some miracle two people received two near identical abilities, the methods by which they used them could be strikingly different. In a fictional world, everyone had set and predictable patterns that could be used to follow an opponent's intentions in the midst of battle. But, in the real world, a burly man could just as easily bring out a strong wind affinity. A person with a strong fire lineage factor could easily be born with a water elemental ability. It was even possible for a close combat specialist to be even better in the long range simply due to an ability they were born with. So, one could imagine how it might feel to have your abilities displayed so grandly. And, not only that, but for their lineage factors to be exposed as well. Almost any thoughts they had of surprise or trickery vanished. It was at that moment that Laren suddenly began to laugh. You know, all this time I was wondering why it was you hated me so much. Laren's laughter grew, his blood boiling. So that's why. I get it, Lionel calmly weighed his black bow in his hands, his gaze never leaving the four before him. Laren's gaze turned toward Aina and his laughter only grew. Brats, I have nothing to do with the matters of all those years ago. I'm not sure why you're targeting me for the actions of a few. Those people you want to kill me for only treat me slightly better than the piece of dirt they see those of impure blood as. Laren's gaze reddened. Clearly, he was feeling indignant. His feelings made sense, for the most part. He obviously didn't receive very great treatment from the family. Maybe it was because his talent wasn't as great, maybe it was because his ability didn't have very great offensive prowess, or maybe it was because he didn't have much backing within the family itself. Regardless of the reason, being targeted because of the actions of someone you didn't like very much to begin with wasn't a pleasant feeling. Of course Laren remembered Aina. Lionel had just described his ability as perfect recall. It could be said that the only reason he didn't recognize Aina immediately was because it had been almost 2 decades since he last saw her from afar. In fact, it wasn't even Aina's looks. No, what he remembered was the exact pattern of the scars drawn across her face. This was his perfect recall at work. How could 2 women have the exact same pattern of scars? Lionel's gaze narrowed at Laren's words, but he still nodded slightly. Even though he wanted to reject Laren's words due to his own bias, he knew that not accepting such a thing and hating him just because of the family he came from would make him no different from the Brazinger family. Like I've said already, if you want to live then just surrender yourselves. I'll release you all just the same. And you expect me to believe that? Do you have a choice? Do you really think we came here alone? The only reason the others haven't closed in is because there's no need to risk innocent lives when it could all be resolved by us. But, if you force us to act, even if by some miracle you manage to defeat the 3 of us, there'll be a world's kingdom waiting to deal with you. Laren and the others shuddered. The only one who still managed to remain a semblance of calm was Amaran. After a long while, Amaran sighed. Kids are getting more and more brazen every day. We asked you if you really knew what you were getting into before, but the question still remains the same. Are you sure you know what you're getting into? Lionel shook his head. Seems you're the one still not getting it. Sir Lancelot. At that moment, the clanking of armor sounded. Amren's confident expression finally changed. In the seemingly quiet forest, the sound of unsheathing blades and rattling chainmail rebounded through the greenery. Somehow, without their knowledge, an entire troop of knights had surrounded them from all directions. At this point, Amren realized he had been played. Though Lionel was maybe confident in defeating them all, doing so while also preventing them from having enough time to activate their talismans to return to Earth would have been too difficult. So, he stalled for time. Now where would they go? Chapter 437. Lionel watched as the four were escorted away. He felt better than he thought he would. Being able to resolve things with his words again rather than his fists left him feeling light. Well, technically he still relied on strength this time around. If it wasn't for his vastly improved method of using Camelot's mage art magic system, it would have been impossible for him to hide so much movement from them all. This was especially considering Laren's perfect recall ability. If there was even a single blade of grass out of place, he likely would have been seen through. Still, Lionel was happy. He didn't have anything to complain about. He could only hope that the negotiations the Empire went as smoothly. Unfortunately, Lionel could only be hopeful about this. The power imbalance between the Empire and them, even if Camelot and the Demon Empire came together, was too large. He obviously couldn't use bully tactics as he had just done if this was the case. Are you sure we'll be able to hold him? A sudden voice cut into Lionel's thoughts. When he looked over, he found Lancelot's figure beside him. Lancelot was wearing the same smile he always did. His mood seemed great. But, Lionel was quite aware that much of this was a facade. A leader of men didn't always have the luxury of wearing his heart on his sleeve. This was a curse that it seemed both Lancelot and Arthur were afflicted with. Lionel nodded. The restrictions I placed on him are modified 3-star Magus arts. Though they're not able to stop him completely, it will take him some effort to break them even if he goes all out. My estimate sits at 7 seconds. By the time he breaks it, he'll already be aware, and that time is enough for me to activate the teleportation key I hid on him. Lancelot nodded with some assurance, his smile as bright as ever. About these negotiations, Lionel. I'm curious about this Ascension Empire and what joining them means for Camelot. Lionel sighed. The Ascension Empire is just like any other. Its main focus is growth, expansion, and holding on to its power. In the past, what mattered most was your talent, and now what also matters most is still your talent. In truth, I wouldn't say that it's any different from Camelot. The only difference is that compared to being at the top like you are now, you will have to fight to hold such a position again. Lionel swept a glance toward Lancelot, half expecting him to defend Camelot and speak words about how much they loved their people and other similar things. In truth, Lionel was being quite kind to Camelot. Compared to the Empire, Camelot treated its lesser-thans far worse. At least on the surface, anyway. Lionel would never forget that the Empire allowed billions to die just so that it would be easier to deal with invalid tides. In fact, much of the reason Lionel didn't run into an invalid despite the early stages Earth was in was precisely because of this. Other worlds in similar positions would have to spend centuries fighting against invalids. By the time they established themselves, their worlds would have to be separated in safe and unsafe zones. But by killing so much immediately, Earth never had to deal with this problem. And, with the exception of the oceans where humans couldn't normally reside anyway, everywhere else was still reasonably safe. Sometimes, Lionel couldn't help but wonder how much of the invention of Paradise Islands were about land shortage, and how much was a plan for this all along. I see. Lancelot nodded, not a hint of derision on his face. I hope they will be better at finding talents than we have been. Lancelot smiled somewhat sadly, a slight crack showing in his usual facade. I didn't have an opportunity to say it before, but I'm sorry for what happened to you. To think that you would also be our savior as well, how ironic. Lionel gave a slight chuckle. I can't take credit for that, it wasn't intentional. In truth, I did it mostly to save my own life. It's just that my selfishness happened to help others. Selfishness, huh? Lancelot sighed, his blue irises dimming somewhat. It's unfortunate that selfishness isn't always possible, and selflessness isn't always rewarded. Lionel remained silent for a long while before finally speaking. Selflessness can only be rewarded after selfishness has finished taking everything it wants first. After that, the selfless can only find time and space to heal. Lancelot froze. He looked toward Lionel's side profile, his pupils visibly trembling. Was it just a coincidence? Lionel's words seemed to resonate with Lancelot's soul. Time and space to heal. At that moment, the ground beneath their feet began to shake. Lionel's gaze sharpened. It's here. That was enough? All this time, Lionel had felt a feeling tugging at the back of his mind. However, his dreamscape didn't seem capable of finding the answer. So, Lionel did it himself. Lionel's mind was even more powerful than maybe even he himself knew. The more he thought about it, the more possibilities he crossed off, the more he realized that there was only one possible explanation left: the zone quests hadn't ended yet. Camelot had already become a part of true history, and Lionel had already saved King Arthur from a fate of death. If he could just resolve the love triangle, everything would be perfect. But there was one issue with this. Lionel couldn't possibly kill Mordred. Let alone the fact that he wouldn't have the heart to do so even if he didn't know her so well. They were now intimately acquainted. To Lionel, killing Mordred would feel no different from killing any one of his teammates. He couldn't bear it. But, that moment when he called Mordred his friend, something clicked. Zones were not a game, so their quests didn't exist just for the sake of existing. The quests were in place as guides to those who entered, allowing them to help along the resolution of the zone as a whole. This was a simple matter. Lionel had long since learned as much during his time within the Joan Zone. What did all of this mean, then? It meant that the quests themselves were not as important as the function they served. Saving King Arthur. Resolving the love triangle. Killing Mordred. Making King Arthur a part of true history. What did all of these quests have in common? It was all about resolving Arthur as a person, helping him to complete his character arc. Oftentimes it was difficult for someone who had been wronged to forgive. There was definitely a timeline of events where Mordred would never forgive her father and even choose to continue her attempts to kill him. When a person is too far gone, despite how tragic their pasts might be, the crudest way to deal with them would be to kill them. In such a reality, Arthur would mourn the loss of his daughter with his wife and son, while Lancelot, being the good man that he is, would take a step back and allow the family to come together. In such a way, Mordred's death would become the catalyst to truly heal Arthur of his ailments. But what if Mordred didn't choose that path? What if she was alright with reconnecting with her family? What if she made the first friend she ever had? In such a case, wouldn't it fulfill the same requirements as her death would have? The savior of King Arthur. The manifestation of Camelot. The resolution of the love triangle. The death of Mordred. The sound of shattering glass resounded throughout the small moon as the world continued to tremble. Lionel felt his heart suddenly thrum to life. It wasn't just him, but every citizen of Earth's world felt the very same way at that exact moment. It was then Lionel understood what his actions meant. Earth was evolving into a fourth-dimensional world. However, Lionel expected what happened next even less. Chapter 438. It had been several weeks since the disappearance of Lionel and Aina. By now, those who had spectated the Brave City trials were well aware that these two youths would not have to participate. Of course, many had an understanding of exactly what this meant. For these two to be personally escorted by the overseers and then disappear, there was a high likelihood that both Lionel and Aina were given the rights to directly enter Valiant Heart Mountain. Unfortunately, there was nothing the others could do about this. Without a choice, they could only continue to follow the proceedings, hoping to gain a spot for themselves. Still, this was the real world. Hopes and dreams couldn't be manifested at will, nor could strong desires make one more talented or wield more power. The so-called geniuses of terrain fell one after another beneath the trials, and it very much seemed as though this would be a repeat of every other year prior where not a single person was selected. However, it was exactly then that a young man stood out. The story of Anared Kafir, the heir to the Kafir city lord title, was quite an interesting one. Since his youth, he had always been known as the genius of terrain just as much as he had been known for his insane tendencies. He was a man who protected his little sister to a fault and was even quite protective of his little sister's best friend as well, though she could be a bit of a ditz. However, the truth was that Anared had always been within the realm of understanding for those of terrain. Though he was lauded and praised, he was ultimately just one of a long line of geniuses that wouldn't amount to much at all in the dimensional verse. Terrain was too small, the talents it could produce were too weak, and the starting point of those talents it did manage to produce were too low. With these shackles on his future progress, Anared participated in the last brave city trial. Without suspense, just like all those who came before him, he failed. The memory was still quite vivid in the eyes of those who had witnessed it all. There were a total of 8 trials to complete. In order to be accepted into Valiant Heart Mountain as the lowest tier disciple, it was necessary to pass at least the 4th. But back then, Anared only managed to make it halfway through the 2nd trial. The trial was a sea of wooden puppets. The only task was to make it from one side of the room to the other, but for so many, it was a trial they would never pass. As a mere king back then, Anared scratched and clawed, his eyes a furious shade of red. Even when he was forcefully pulled out of the trial by the overseers at that time, his gaze was still wholly focused on the goal ahead of him. He looked like he would rather die than not make it to the other side. It was impossible to tell what his motivation was. Who could read the mind of a madman? Did he just want to get stronger? Did he have something to protect? Something he wanted to accomplish? No one knew. But those red eyes and the way he clung to the broken hilt of his sword was seared into the minds of all those who watched that day. After failing the trial, it became hard to hear of Anared again. All people knew was that he went off to travel for several years, even missing the next entry to Brave City. Many thought he had given up due to that. But no one blamed him. He was a talented young man who went to see the world and even managed to come back with a beautiful wife. There was no doubt that Era was a preeminent beauty of terrain. Not only this, but she also had the refined demeanor of a lady. But what no one expected was for Anared to participate in this one as well. Not only for him to succeed, but for him to completely outperform his previous limitations. Many thought that Anared was at most on par with the other emperors. In fact, due to the way he reacted when the other emperors came to apply pressure to his sector, many confirmed this belief. But, once again, no one could get a read on the thoughts of a madman. He crossed the 3rd trial and faced the 4th. Many emperors of the past had reached this level but could never clear it. It was a trial that tested one's movement speed and flexibility, a death obstacle course of swinging blades and shadow-hidden assassins. Yet, Anared crossed it with ease. With a sword in his hand, his movements became like flowing water. Even as the other emperors failed at this step, he crossed into the 5th trial, then the 6th. In the end, under the astonished gazes of all those around him, Anared made it through the 7th and almost all the way through the 8th before he was forced to stop. Beaten and bloodied, he stood on the final 8th floor, the jagged bladed axe of a giant having stopped just before his neck. Even at that moment, a defiant look blazed within his eyes. He kept looking up at the giant as though he still wanted to hack it to pieces. It was clear to anyone who saw him that he was still unsatisfied with his result. Xyler watched on from afar, his hands tightly gripped around his broken spear shaft. He hadn't even been able to pass through the 1st trial. No amount of fire in his gut or will in his soul could help him overcome his lack of talent at the moment. All sorts of complex feelings shook his core as he watched Anared proceed to where no one of terrain had ventured before. It was as though watching Anared do it gave him even more determination to do it himself. He too would reach that level one day, he too would shock everyone with a single feat. Chapter 439. Anared calmly received his spatial ring, the sword hovering to his back still singing. It was clear that his battle intent was still roaring, but there was no longer a trial to face. He had failed to clear the final hurdle. After a few words from the overseers, everyone was ejected from Brave City. Another round had come to an end. It would be several more years until Brave City opened up its tall, bloodthirsty gates once again. Days later, within the Kefir family city lordship, a meeting was taking place. But, if those who understood the relations between the city lords saw this meeting, they would be shocked out of their wits. Not only was the forever lone wolf black family city lord present, but even the Swan family city lord who had always butted heads with the Kefir family was present. To make matters more shocking, this was just one of the usually estranged or clashing relationships in the room. City lords from all over Terrain were gathered, each one with a complicated network of relationships with those around them. Yet, each and every single one of them had set aside their differences to appear at this meeting. The setting was a room reserved for grand banquets. Elaborate chandeliers hung in the air, long tables that extended for tens of meters seated those numbering in the several dozen, while the decorations were designed to impress. Though this wasn't the most appropriate location for such a meeting, it was the only place that could house so many important characters. It wasn't that there were hundreds of city lords on Terrain. In fact, there were only a dozen. The main issue was that none of these city lords, due to what was at stake, would want to appear here unguarded and unprotected. The luck of it was that since these city lords had brought their entourages to Brave City in the first place, they wouldn't draw the attention of those they wanted to hide their actions from. In fact, the fact they had all appeared in such a large banquet rather than slinking off sneakily made this even less of a matter to pay attention to. Of course, there was one other big reason this would work despite how foolish it was. They all had a reason to attend this banquet. And that reason was provided to them by the success of Anared Kefir. City Lord Kefir stood from his hosting position, a confident smile on his face. Even his full beard couldn't hide the grin on his lips. You all know the rules. These were the first words the city lord said. As for what the rules were, only they knew that. Since my son has met the goal we all set, I will be taking the lead of this operation as previously agreed upon. I hope that there would be no rejections to this, right? The banquet hall remained silent. They weren't fools. They knew that anyone who rocked the boat now would be immediately executed, city lord or not. It was precisely because of how volatile this seemingly genial atmosphere was that they all brought their guards despite the lack of secrecy that could cause. It was only with the status provided by Anared that they could execute this operation with less worries. As such, it was only right the Kefir family took the lead. It was just unfortunate that none of their own heirs could have the same accomplishments. Hearing such words, the various guards and lesser vassals of the city lords looked around in confusion. What they didn't know was that the so-called rules were exactly in place to cause this sort of vagueness and unassuredness. This operation had been being planned for years. Actually, it was more accurate to say that it had been decades. In all this time, this was the very first instance in which all the city lords had come together. In fact, this was the very first time they all had a direct line of communication with one another. Other than City Lord Kefir, the others hadn't even been sure that all the city lords would participate. It was only now that they were all certain that everyone was on board. But, it was exactly this secrecy and this slyness that gave the city lords confidence. There were eyes and ears everywhere, especially in this era of abilities. It could be said that City Lord Kefir had proved himself. Even if Anared had failed, they would have still elected him to be the leader of this operation. This operation was too important to them. It could be said that even in the case of Anared failing, they would have moved forward regardless. When it came to matters of life and death and the futures of their coming generations, they had to be prepared. Good. I want everyone to be ready to move out within the month. The month quickly came and went. The city lords had been prepared to move out any day for the last 5 years already. Let alone being prepared within a month, they had long since primed themselves. Among these 12 city lords, there were 4 women. And, among these women, there was one with a very complicated relationship with City Lord Kefir. Though the common people didn't dare to spread rumors about city lords, what was to stop the city lords themselves from doing so? It was said that in their youth, this city lord White was once a lover of city lord Kefir. However, for whatever reason, city lord Kefir married another who gave birth to his current son and daughter. According to the rumors, city lord White visited the Kefir city lordship just once in the last 30 years. And it was said that she brought a baby along with her back then. But, when she left, that baby was no longer on her person. Regardless of whether those rumors were true or not, city lord White had long since returned to her city. The thoughts of all those years ago had long since been thrust from her mind. Chapter 440. City lord White sat in an office, a map spread out across her desk. She had long since memorized its contents, but due to a sudden change that happened a while ago, she wanted to ensure that she had it all imprinted into her mind. The city lord was quite unique in comparison to other women of terrain. It was very rare to find technologically advanced places like Earth, and thus even rarer to find equality amongst men and women, at least in low-level worlds. Technology acted as an equating factor between men and women. The strength of a man meant less if a woman could simply pull out a gun and deal with a threat just as easily as he could. In low-level worlds like terrain, the awakening of abilities didn't have much time to create a balance between the sexes like technology could. This was all to say that in terrain and worlds like it, having women in positions of power was a rarity. And, finding women like City Lord White was even a level more rare. City Lord White had exceptionally short-cut white hair. Her demeanor was quite valiant, and she chose to wear black robes accented by white flexible armor. Everything from the way she sat and spoke seemed to exude a masculine air. Even her handwriting was boisterous, purposeful, and bold. She was quite tall, especially for a woman. She stood at over 6 feet, but this didn't dampen her figure in the slightest. Her hips were wide and her bosom was bountiful. At that very moment, seemingly without reason, City Lord White froze. She stood, a sadistic grin on her face. Her face even became somewhat flushed, as though she was excited. She touched a spatial bracer on her right arm. Her gaze only grew more excited after pulling out a talisman glowing with a blinding light. It was finally time. Bang! She smashed a fist against her large desk, splitting it in half and kicking its pieces out of her way. Her hand swept forward and snatched out the map before it could fall to the ground, carelessly tossing it into her spatial bracer. "Someone get me my Clara. Now!" Her booming voice shot over White City. An impossibly vast aura shot out from the city lord's body. The result was a city that fell into immediate silence. It didn't matter if it was a noble or a humble street vendor, they all felt their knees buckle. The city lord's mansion began to glow. City Lord White kicked down the door of her office. To the side of the now broken opening, a patient secretary with her hands respectfully clasped before her sent a glance toward the flying door and didn't seem to react very much at all. City Lord White turned toward the secretary, a bloodthirsty light in her eye. It was difficult to tell if she was excited, enraged, or in heat. "Naya, give me my Clara, we're moving out." "Yes, City Lord." The secretary bowed politely. With a small clap of her hands, a light appeared in the secretary's hands and slowly expanded. Eventually, when that light dimmed, all that was left was a monstrosity of a weapon. It had a polearm of 2.5 meters long alone. But the true shock was its head. It was a hammer, but even calling it so seemed to not do it justice. The head had 2 massive blunt ends that shimmered like the surface of a mirror. Each head just under 1 meter in diameter each, easily matching more than half the size of most bodies. City Lord White snatched this massive weapon from Naya's hands. "Ah, Clara, Clara, Clara. We're going to taste blood again." Clara seemed to react to these words too, a shimmering light racing across its polished surface. City Lord White strolled down the hallways of her mansion, wantonly swinging Clara around and not giving a damn about the damage. Naya could only follow quickly behind, calmly taking note of all the newly created holes and sending out orders for repair. The two quickly made their way out of the mansion, every one of City Lord White's steps causing the ground to sway and tremble. The head of City Lord White's mansion was completely unlike what one would expect. While others would pave the way for vehicles or decorate with elaborate gardens, the front of the White Mansion was a military field. On this military field, tens of thousands of warriors had already gotten into formation. They all stood ramrod straight, their chests sticking out with pride. Hi! The instant City Lord White appeared, a collective breath was taken as the army roared as one. The crisp sound of shifting clothing pierced through the soul as they saluted in unison, crossing their hands over their hearts. City Lord White stood atop the stairs of her mansion, her smothering aura towering into the skies. Bang! The butt of her massive weapon smashed against the ground, causing waves of trembling earth to spread in every direction. To her back, Naya continued to stand, her hands clasped together respectfully. The importance of this battle wasn't lost on any of them. This was a turning point. For a long time already, terrain had been teetering at the very edge, standing at the start of a diverging path. To one side, there was the abandonment of everything their ancestors had ever built, everything they had ever strived for. To the other, there was a slim hope. But it required their sweat, their tears, their blood. And, even then, they could very well fail. Their future would be decided by this battle, this war. Whether they could hold their heads high or be buried in the cemetery of their hopes and dreams, it would all be decided now. Today, we go to battle. Hi! Today, we'll brandish our blades toward the necks of our enemies. Hi! Today, we'll either shed blood or shed the blood of others. Hi! Follow me to those crimson fields. Give me the beating hearts from your chests. Lay down your lives for me. Hi! 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 The glow of White City grew to a fever pitch. Then, inexplicably, the entire city disappeared. Chapter 441. It's time. In Black City, preparations were underway as well. The only difference was that while City Lord White took sole leadership, Black City was headed by a father-son pair. Jirak was stunned out of his thoughts when he heard his father's voice. The two men looked practically like copies of one another. Jirak's father had the same bald-head, black armor and jagged beard his son did. The only difference was that Jirak's father was a head taller than he was. Obviously, since Jirak was already in his 30s, this wasn't a matter of youth. Rather, Jirak's father simply had a far larger stature. Get the men ready. Jirak's father continued. The city will be disappearing in just a few minutes. Yes, father. Jirak nodded and went off to complete the last of his duties. Jirak was lost in his thoughts as he made his way toward the military fields. Black City wouldn't be taking action immediately, so their mental state didn't need to be in a primed state. Not that Jirak was in the headspace to give a motivational speech to begin with. He had just failed the brave city trials miserably and his heart was still being shadowed by a perpetual guilt. Even now, he could still remember Lionel's complete disregard of him. If Lionel had ignored him, it would have been one thing. But, Jirak remembered making eye contact with Lionel just one time while they were both still on the first floor. Back then, it had been as though Lionel was looking at a stranger. He glanced at him as though he was observing someone he had seen for the first time and moved away from him just as easily. The way Lionel looked at him at that moment was something he would never forget, at least if Lionel never looked in his direction, he could make himself believe that Lionel felt some anger toward him. Somehow, he felt that that would make him feel better. After all, anger was just another way of acknowledging someone's existence. But, to so genuinely treat him as though they had never met before, as the son and heir to a city lordship, he never thought he would ever have to deal with emotions like this. He never thought anything could make him feel this way, let alone due to someone he had met so recently. However, deep down, Jirak knew that his emotions were less about Lionel and more about letting down himself. Jirak shook his head. It doesn't matter anymore. Back on Camelot's moon, Lionel was still in a state of shock. He hadn't expected that the zone quests had truly not been over, but he had expected even less, that the reward for completing them would be accelerating Earth into the fourth dimension. Lionel's expression changed. Without waiting for anyone to react, he shot to Amran's side and sent the strongest punch he could at the latter's chin. Amran was completely flabbergasted by the change. He still didn't understand what was happening. All he knew was that he was bound now, and even if he wasn't, it would take him too much time to undo Lionel's restrictions. His last thought was that Lionel had tricked him and that he was basically a dead man. His vision went black, collapsing to the ground. Lancelot's eyes widened. Lancelot froze. Huh. At that moment, Lancelot suddenly felt as though shackles that had held him down for decades suddenly imploded. Strength flooded into his body at impossible rates. In the blink of an eye he was twice as powerful, then 3 times, then 4 times. Eventually, it got to be so much that even he no longer understood just how powerful he was in comparison to his former self. Lionel stumbled backward, the forcefulness of Lancelot's breakthrough being too great. The wind kicked up and even the several meter-thick trees around them began to sway. Lionel put a forearm over his eyes, trying to peek through to see what was happening. But he soon realized that it wasn't just Lancelot. At that moment, dozens, even hundreds of knights they had brought with them were experiencing similar power boosts. Lionel looked down at Amran's unconscious body and suddenly felt a bit bad. The reason he had taken him down like that was because if Camelot entered the fourth dimension, the restrictions on Amran's strength would have been completely lifted. By then, he would have been too troublesome to deal with. Lionel sent an apologetic gaze toward the other 3 hidden family members. But, considering the fear in their eyes and the way they were trying to distance themselves, Lionel felt that his smile might not have been as kind as he thought. Aina smiled lightly at Lionel's embarrassed expression. But, truthfully, Lionel made the right move in such a situation. The worst-case scenario was definitely a terrible situation they didn't want to be in. This makes sense, though. They've been stuck at the peak of the third dimension for so long, it's only right they break through. It's likely related to their unique magic system, too, Aina. Aina blinked, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. Lionel couldn't help but smile when he saw this. She was still so shy, all he did was call her name. Aina currently found it troublesome to even look at Lionel. Every time she did, she would remember what happened before. She furiously shook her head, looking away. Lionel began to ask the question he was planning to, but Lancelot's sudden burst of laughter shocked him out of his train of thought. Lancelot spread out his arms as though trying to catch the rays of the sun falling through the heavy canopies above. For the first time in months, the heavy rain of Camelot finally came to a stop, allowing the clouds to separate. As a warrior, Lancelot had spent his whole life training. He never thought there would be a day where he could finally break through the final barrier, but here that day was. He felt better than he ever had before. To an outside observer, he had simply broken through. But to him, it felt as though he had seen the light at the end of a dark tunnel. He hadn't thought that a simple shift in his mindset would bring him such benefits. Lionel, thank you. Lionel opened his mouth to respond again, but it seemed as though the universe had something against him today. But, this time, the cause of the interruption was far more serious. It was serious to the point where it just might decide the life and death of Earth as a world. The sound of shattering glass reverberated throughout. Whether you were on Camelot, on the moon, or on Earth, everyone heard it. It felt as though the fabric of time and space itself was quaking, threatening to tear itself apart. Lionel looked up through the dense foliage, barely catching a glimpse of a sight he would never forget in his life. A city had appeared in the sky. And, this city was falling toward them. At the top of this city's gates, a lone woman dressed in black robes accented by white soft armor stood, a massive hammer in her hand as she looked down toward the rapidly approaching Camelot. A bloodthirsty aura soon enveloped their lands. Those faint of heart felt as though there simply wasn't enough air to breathe. Terrain was invading. Chapter 442. Lionel's eyes widened. Everything suddenly clicked at once. However, there was simply no time to harp on it. Run! Lionel roared. The impact of such a massive object hitting the ground from such a height would be enormous. A meteor of 100 kilometers across would be enough to annihilate all life on Earth. Even though this city was only 10 kilometers across and its velocity was much slower in comparison to a meteor, Lionel was absolutely certain that its hardness was far beyond anything a normal meteor could compare with. If this wasn't the case, how would they dare to stay within its walls as they fell from the skies? Plus, this wasn't Earth. It was a small moon. Lionel wasn't sure how his calculations would change in a true fourth-dimensional world like this one, but he didn't have the mental space to spare. Without hesitation, Lionel grasped at Aina's hand and charged out. But he soon realized that despite his speed, Aina actually had no problem keeping up with him. In fact, she was the one dragging him forward. Swiftness, second wind, breath of wings, Lionel cast as many wind speed spells as he could in quick succession. His affinity for the wind element wasn't very high, so the expenditure of his soul force was several levels more. But this wasn't a situation where he had the mind to care about such things. The knights around Lionel and Aina were a second later in reacting, but they too shot forward trusting in Lionel's judgment. With their speed, even covering a few hundred meters wouldn't be impossible by the time the city hit the ground. In this situation, every extra foot they could gain was an extra chance at living. Lionel's soul force continued to surge. He never realized it before, but it seemed that shackles on his own body were loosening greatly as well. His mind felt freer than it ever had before. Lionel let Aina pull him along, his mind entirely focused on his spell. He dug deep, a violent wind kicking up around him. Yip! Yip! Don't worry about me, little black star. Stay in the air and in your incorporeal state. Don't come down here, we'll be fine. The little mink skipped through the air, steps of black fog forming before it. But a clearly distressed expression was on his little face. Though the little guy couldn't understand what was happening, he had a deep enough connection with Lionel to know that something bad was coming. The more panicked the knights saw Lionel feel, the more panicked they also seemed to become. The most troublesome part about it all was that they were in a forest, constantly having to dodge around trees and branches. The terrain made them slow down by several factors more than they would have in practically any other landscape. Without time to care for anything else, they had even gone as far as to abandon the prisoners they had already captured, allowing them to run on their own. At that moment, the city falling from the skies was already within half a kilometer of the ground. Just the wind pressure of its descent was enough to give Lionel an even stronger tailwind than previously, allowing his spell formation to speed up by several levels. Brace yourselves! Lionel roared. Lionel pulled back on Aina's hand, stunning her for a moment. All of her forward momentum stalled in that instant. But Lionel didn't give her time to say anything else. With one swift motion, he grabbed onto her slender waist and sent the large curved package on her back and the great sword in her hand into the segmented cube. Instead of continuing forward, Lionel launched himself into the air, cradling Aina's body close to his own. Lionel's body seemed enveloped by a blinding light in that moment. Those who could only catch a faint glimpse would swear that they had laid eyes on a soaring bird. He leapt from tree branch to tree branch, shooting past 100 meters into the air in what felt like the blink of an eye. The instant Lionel reached the tallest canopy, his gaze sharpened, all the strength he could muster bowing his legs and causing his thighs to explosively increase a fold in size. Ha! Lionel flooded force into his legs and launched himself toward the clouds. As though he was a bullet, he left a streak of golden light in his wake, a violent cyclone of wind shattering the tree he had used as a springboard. In the distance, the city reached within 100 meters of the ground. The wind pressure alone flattened the forest beneath it, uprooting trees and sending them flying in every direction. Shoo! Bang! The city suddenly came to a sudden grinding halt. Unlike what Lionel had expected, it never physically touched the ground. However, the damage. It was one of the most basic laws of physics. For every action, there was an equal and opposite reaction. A city falling from the skies like a meteor, weighing an impossibly great amount, suddenly coming to a stop like that wouldn't magically make everything better. The world seemed to fall silent for a moment until the ground suddenly registered just the level of force it was about to withstand. The earth exploded, surging like a tide along with strong winds to all sides. If trees were uprooted before, now, even ancient trees that dug hundreds of meters into the ground were blasted away. The soil, the rock, the greenery, it was all uprooted, spreading out as though using the floating city as the epicenter of disaster. The tsunami of Earth seemed to gain speed the further it spread, its momentum increasing and rolling over endlessly. At this moment, Lionel had reached his apex, just barely 500 meters above the surface. Seeing what was happening below him, his jaw clenched. He wasn't sure if the others could survive, but at the moment, he didn't have time to worry about them. Even he wasn't safe just yet. Veins bulged out from Lionel's forehead, his strain reaching a new level. Float. Chapter 443. Using a spell you had no affinity with took an obscene amount of spirit pressure. Sometimes, when the Mage Academy of Camelot gained a child of rare affinity, they would have no choice but to give them a teacher who might very well not have any talent in the child's field. In such a case, the teacher would do their best to guide the child in the fundamentals. But, even in that case, the strongest spells the teacher might cast would be apprentice-level arts. However, float wasn't an apprentice-level art. In fact, it was well known as one of the most difficult to cast magus arts in all of Camelot. Not only was Lionel casting a 3-star magus art he had no affinity with, but he was also using it in a situation he had no business using it in. Float was only meant to help one hover 10 meters above the ground at most. And even then, every second one spent at that height would cost a huge expenditure of spirit pressure even for a high-affinity wind mage. Yet, Lionel not only had no wind affinity, but he was over 500 meters in the sky. Wind mages would often use float, like an earth mage would use a defensive technique. It was only a method of protecting themselves in battle for a short period of time. Every extra meter they soared into the air, the exponentially more spirit pressure they would need to use. "Send me inside," Aina suddenly said. She hadn't spoken a word since Lionel pressed her against his chest like this. She didn't want to admit it to herself, but she found it to be quite comfortable. But, her comfort wasn't worth Lionel's strain. The fact that Lionel had sent her box and sword in was enough to show that every extra pound was a huge strain to him. Of course, it wasn't that Lionel wouldn't rather send Aina in, but rather that sending in a living object compared to an inanimate one was a completely different concept. For the same reason Lionel had to knock Ailiard out first before stuffing him into a snow globe, he couldn't casually send Aina wherever he wanted whenever he wanted. In that split second, it was better for him to take this action than explaining his plan. Who knew what might happen? If he told Aina not to resist and that he'd be fine, who knew if she'd believe him? Just when Lionel was about to answer Aina and agree to her suggestion, veins bulging across his forehead, it hit them. Yip! Yip! Do as I said, Lionel roared in his mind. Bang! It was just the surge of wind finally reaching them. It was far weaker than what it was on the ground. Yet, it felt as though they had been smashed by a sledgehammer. Lionel wrapped his arms around Aina tightly. He could feel bits and pieces of rocks and chipped wood rebounding across his back, trying to tear his skin apart. Lionel! Aina cried out. Lionel grinned. In all his life, this was only the second time he could remember Aina calling out his name. Don't worry, I have thick skin. Lionel sent his voice to Aina's ears. If not for this, it was doubtful that she would be able to hear him at all. Aina didn't seem comforted by these words at all, but there was nothing she could do. If she tried to force her way out of Lionel's protection, it would only make everything worse. There was no time where Lionel wanted to use his shuttle more, but he knew it would be useless to do so here. The shuttle provided too little control. It was great at straight-line speed, but Lionel had just been in a forest. By the time he managed to make it above the foliage, it was already too late to guarantee making it out of the range of the shockwave. If the shuttle got hit by the shockwave, Lionel was certain it would be able to hold up against the elements alone, but he would have no control of it. According to his simulations, the likelihood of it crashing into the ground was near 100%. In that case, it was far better to rely on his own body, which he had far more control of. And, even though the surfboard form of the shuttle gave greater nimbleness, it provided no protection whatsoever. If Lionel brought it out now, it would be more likely to just get lost in all the chaos instead of helping them escape. "I'll definitely modify that damn thing," Lionel roared in his heart as he tumbled through the air like loose trash. Every time it seemed that Lionel might be headed toward the ground, he would grit his teeth and activate, float, in full force again, slowing his descent. It was exactly this level of control he wouldn't have in the shuttle. Slowly but surely, the tsunami of earth and walls of wind began to calm. According to Lionel calculations, they had been blown over 2 kilometers away from their original location, and this was after going half a kilometer into the skies. Lionel couldn't even imagine the devastation on the ground. Seeing that it was calm enough, Lionel slowly opened his eyes. The surroundings were filled with a dense fog of dirt and soil. It was the kind of air one couldn't breathe in too deeply. Lionel summoned the shuttle and entered the surfboard mode, instantly stopping his descent to the ground. He slowly rose, trying to get to a point where his vision was clear of this mushroom cloud of earth. When he finally did, he was already over a kilometer above the surface, and what he saw left him stunned. Devastation. Absolute devastation. Where there once was an endless forest of greenery, there was nothing but overturned earth. The land had become a slosh of broken trees, sand, soil, and rock. Lionel couldn't even begin to imagine the devastation this had caused to the wildlife, and he was even more worried about what happened to Lancelot and the others. Aina looked down from her position in Lionel's arms, her heart also trembling. They both locked eyes onto the floating city in the distance. At that moment, White City finally completed its descent, perfectly fitting into the hole in the ground it had created. Seeing such a scene, Lionel shuddered. What was the most difficult part about invading another world? Wasn't it gaining a foothold? But, what if you came with your own foothold? What if you brought your own fortified city to launch your attacks from? Chapter 444. Lionel took a deep breath. At the moment, they were about 20 or so kilometers from Camelot's main city. But, between here and there were 2 baronies and several smaller settlements. Who knew how many of them were affected by this earthen tsunami? Though it benefits them to bring a city along, they definitely faced complications themselves. There were many benefits to wiping out all the land around them like this, the main of which was the fact this fallen city didn't have to worry about attacks in the immediate future, while also wiping out any potential nearby settlements Camelot might have had. But, this method was a double-edged sword. While White City now couldn't be easily attacked, they also couldn't easily launch any attacks either. Marching an army through this mess would be a nightmare. It made Lionel feel like this was a purposeful choice. Lionel felt that there was an over 98% chance that their current attackers were the city lords of Terrain. The information he had access to put him in a unique position where he likely knew more about their current enemies than anyone of the Empire or the Slayer Legion did. This perspective allowed him to understand that this wasn't a quick invasion plan. If Lionel put himself in the shoes of those city lords, their goal wasn't just to conquer Earth, it was to make Earth their new home. The reason for this could be summarized in a single sentence: Earth had more potential than Terrain. As for why they waited until now, that was even more straightforward. There was no coincidence they waited for the exact instant Earth evolved into the 4th dimension. And, unfortunately, due to Camelot's appearance, this happened long before Earth had fully settled itself. Lionel's actions had inadvertently placed Earth in a bad position. Lionel felt somewhat complicated. On the one hand, he felt that Earth was no longer truly a home to him anymore. But, on the other, he felt a twisting pain in his chest watching it being invaded this way. Lionel descended from the skies, riding his jet-black surfboard back into the dense cloud of kicked-up dirt and soil. Bear with it for a bit. Lionel spoke softly to Aina. I want to see if I can find any of the others. Aina wanted to say something like you can let me go now, but sensing Lionel's downcast mood, she remained silent, resting her ear against his chest. Lionel touched down to the ground, his brows furrowing. This will be difficult, but it's still worth a try. Repulse. A sphere of wind twirled around Lionel and suddenly expanded violently. In the blink of an eye, it cleared the heavy atmosphere. Repulse was a 3-star mage art usually used as an area control sphere to push enemies away. So, it was quite effective in its task. Lionel took a deep breath in the cleared air, closing his eyes and planting his 2 feet firmly in what ground he could find. In fact, he sunk in ankle deep into the rolling dirt and rocks. Seismic wave. A strong surge of spirit pressure shot out from Lionel. If one looked closely, it was possible to see small ripples in the loose earth beneath his feet. There were many sensory-specific spells within Camelot's magic system. They not only existed within the auxiliary types, but they also existed within the elemental types as well. Wind elemental and earth elemental spells especially had many of them for obvious reasons. Seismic wave was a 3-star magus art used for scouting with the earth element. It worked almost like echolocation, except with sensing changes in the earth rather than with sound. Several small waves were sent out that were practically imperceptible to the eye. On solid ground, there would be no visual cues at all. But, in loose ground like this, it showed up similar to the way a pond would ripple after experiencing a thrown stone. Everything within several kilometers was suddenly fed back to Lionel. There were very few limitations to seismic wave. It took very little energy to send a wave out, the only real limitation was how sharp the senses of the person sending them out was. It was said that certain animals could sense the coming of an earthquake days in advance. Such small changes could be detected by mere beasts of the 3rd dimension. So what about Lionel? Even after reaching out 10 kilometers, Lionel still didn't feel like he had reached his limit. He had even crossed the barrier of the city in the distance. But, he shook his head and focused again. Instead of distance, he focused on depth. This required stronger waves and a bit more earth elemental force, but it was still within Lionel's ability even though his previous uses of float had almost burned him out. Simply put, thanks to his 3-star constitution, Lionel's recovery of soul force was unmatched. Lionel's breath suddenly hitched and his heart grew heavy. He had found his first dead body. His heart clenched, his hold on Aina involuntarily becoming tighter. He found another. Then another. Many of them were crushed beneath the weight of the heavy earth. Some unlucky ones were struck by heavy flying stones and trees, causing damage they couldn't live through. Some others were pierced through by errant sharp branches. Lionel continued to search, going deeper and deeper. But, somewhere deep inside, he realized that the deeper he went, the less likely he was to find someone he could save. There. There. Lionel almost cried out. Lionel found one beating heart, then another. His breathing grew quicker. This was good, some had survived. This was definitely good. As long as he helped them climb back out, their lives should be saved. Unfortunately, Lionel was a bit too naive. One of the most important aspects of war was the element of surprise. Keeping one's enemies on their toes, catching them unawares, and gaining victories for the smallest price in exchange. These were the staples of good generals. Since Terrain's city lords had planned this matter for so long, how could they be unable to predict what would happen to the landscape around them? And how could they allow that landscape to force them to give up their advantage? The sharp call of several beasts shook Lionel out of his focused state. His head tilted up into the skies, peering through the dense cloud of dirt only to barely make out a sight that made his heart tremble. Birds. Hundreds of them. Each one with a wingspan of no less than 5 meters while some of the largest were over 20 meters in width. On their backs, each had 2 warriors. One was outfitted with a polearm weapon while the other manned a massive crossbow machine strapped to the backs of these massive birds of prey. White City was already attacking and their first wave would be an aerial assault. Chapter 445. Lionel was instantly at a loss. If he continued saving those buried beneath the rubble, many of whom were unconscious, he would be allowing this attack to continue on smoothly. But, if he moved to stop them now, it was very likely that many of those he could save would die. Damn it! Lionel roared in his mind. Lionel. Huh? Lionel snapped out of his own thoughts. Just point out where they are to me and I'll dig them out. I can't battle in the skies like you can. Lionel opened his mouth to reply but wasn't exactly sure what to say. It would definitely be more efficient for them to be saved by him. He could use his earth elemental affinity to simply carry them out. But, Aina would have to physically dig them out. Just leave it to me. Aina insisted. More people will die than those buried down if they're allowed to go. Lionel's hesitation was broken when he heard these words. She was right. If they managed to make it to one of the baronies, hundreds would die. Aina pushed off, breaking out of Lionel's embrace and landing on the ground. They can't see me on the ground through all the dirt clouds. Stop worrying about me. Lionel blinked and nodded. The first is 57 meters in that direction and 13 meters underground. With that, Lionel shot into the skies. The formation of predatory birds soared through the skies in perfect formation. They were split into groups of 11. Each group of 11 was split into 3 groups. The first group formed the outer structure of the formation. At the helm, there was 1 bird and following its wings there were 3 birds to each side for a total of 7 forming this outer structure. This first group formed an inverted V structure. The second group was likewise an AV structure, but they were tucked within the larger outer structure. This inner structure was formed of smaller, swifter birds and there were just 3 of them. The final group was actually just a single bird. This bird protected the commander to the back of this double inverted V structure. In the end, from afar, it looked as though numerous triangular formations were flying through the air. They looked no different from jets shooting through the skies, all of them exuding a 4th-dimensional aura. This sort of formation should have been far beyond Lionel's means to deal with. The only reason Aina didn't stop him wasn't because she wasn't worried, but rather because she knew that trying to stop Lionel would have been useless. He was simply too fond of doing stupid things to save people he didn't even know, let alone the fact he was now doing so to protect those he thought of as his friends. In Lionel's mind, Mordred was now a close friend of his. If Camelot fell, it would be Mordred's family that suffered the most. How could he allow such a thing to happen? At the center of these numerous smaller formations, a man wearing black robes accented by white flexible armor stood atop a predator bird of his own. Unlike the others, he was the only one on the back of this bird. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his hair shaved down until only the smallest bristles remained. The rushing winds whipped against his face, but it was as though his skin was tightly stapled to his skeleton. His stern expression never distorted, nor did his eyes ever blink. He was one of City Lord White's White Knights, Khaled Dior. Lionel stood in the skies, a simple, light refraction, a ray centered around him. The more he observed the coming tide of predatory birds, the more he realized he didn't stand a chance. Even ignoring the warriors and assault weapons on their backs, just the beasts alone were beyond anything Lionel had ever seen before. They had beaks that glistened like the blades of a polished spear. Their black feathers caused the light of the setting sun to rebound as though they were metal plates. Their eyes were a bright shade of crimson that exuded a bloodthirsty light as though all they knew was slaughter. As though this wasn't enough, Lionel felt that the large crossbows fitted to their backs contained much more power than 23rd century cannons. By his estimations, they were weaker than 25th century technology, but marginally stronger than 24th. And, unlike Earth's technology, they weren't negatively influenced by force in the slightest. None of this even began to touch upon the humans that managed to command these beasts and control these machines. Lionel was simply in over his head. He was still within the 3rd dimension and he was just a single person facing almost 500. Any smart person would turn tail and run. Lionel took several deep breaths, trying to calm his beating heart. For a moment, he closed off his senses. He heard nothing, saw nothing, felt nothing. Earth was probably in chaos at this moment. Lionel could almost feel it. Everyone's lives had already been turned upside down once, but here it was again. But, he was lucky. He had talent. If he wanted to and had the time, he could gain the strength to protect himself, but not everyone could claim this. Did Lionel feel some sort of responsibility because of this? He would be lying if he said no. But, somewhere inside, he felt it was more than this. It was the same feeling he got on the football field, the same feeling he felt when he sat down at an exam, the same feeling he had when he stepped onto his first battlefield. Lionel opened his eyes, a mad grin spreading across his face as his irises flickered a wild violet red. Lionel flipped his palm, causing a familiar black rhino's horn to appear. He brought it slowly to his lips, his blood boiling and his skin flushing crimson as bronze runes danced across it. That's a nice formation you have there, would be a shame if someone ruined it. These birds might seem mighty and menacing, but these were exactly the kind of beasts most susceptible to outside influences. Seeing such odds before him only made Lionel want to win even more. It was exactly then Lionel blew on the horn with all his might, pouring his spirit pressure into it. The people of Terrain had pissed him off many times already. Lionel even believed that the so-called fugitives they had bribed Shield Cross stars into looking for were those who wanted to blow the whistle on this maddening plan of theirs. Unfortunately, before those fugitives could do much of anything, Earth's evolution was accelerated, causing them to enter the fourth dimension before anyone predicted. Lionel remembered how he had been treated just because he was weak. He remembered how Jirak refused to tell him what they were hiding even after he spared his life. He saw the way they tried to humiliate Aina, his Aina. Since they wanted war, he would give it to them. Chapter 446. The blaring sound of a horn tore across the skies. The perfect formation of predator birds was instantly shaken. Their riders, which had spent years learning how to tame these wild beasts, were suddenly at a loss. It felt as though they were riding bucking bulls. White Knight Dior's gaze sharpened. Despite the wild reaction of his predatory bird was equally as wild, his feet remained attached as though they had been sewn together. This noise. Khaled locked onto a particular direction. Even though his eyes saw nothing in that spot, he trusted his senses. There was most definitely an enemy right there. Lionel felt the White Knight's aura lock onto him. The feeling was like being gripped by the hands of death. He knew from the very beginning that light refraction wasn't infallible. But it only made it worse now that he was funneling the abilities of this horn right toward the flock of birds. Even if the sight of him didn't give him away, the direction in which the blaring horn was coming from most definitely did. But Lionel didn't stop blowing. From behind his light refraction spell, he locked eyes with Khaled, his blood boiling. The White Knight stomped down hard on his predator bird, sending a violent shock through its body and waking it up. By now, the perfect formation had devolved into a wild flock of birds flying in every which direction. In fact, out of their control, many on the backs of these predator birds fell from their backs. Without a choice, they pulled out an inconspicuous short pole from their harnesses. With a few clicks, they became gliders. Watching so many fall from the skies, Lionel sighed a breath of relief, thinking they would have no choice but to return to White City. But, to his astonishment, as though they were assigned a life and death mission, these gliders continued forward toward their original destinations, not gazing back toward White City even once. Lionel's heart froze over. This was the first time he truly felt the resolve of these warriors. Damn it. Lionel put his horn away and pulled out his black bow and slipped on his bowman gloves. It was a palpable pressure, it was the kind Lionel hadn't felt before. In all his life, he had never faced such dauntless, fearless warriors. The demons loved war, but they still feared death. They still stormed the battlefields, but they weren't a single unit, forged together by blood and sweat. These warriors were different, though. It was impossible for them to have guessed that someone would be able to disrupt their plan before it even truly began. Yet, they reacted as though it didn't matter. Despite the fact they hadn't sensed Lionel's location like their captain had, they still traveled toward him dauntlessly, not a single one of them cowering in fear. Lionel felt like he was back on those French battlefields, facing those mortal men who threw their life away to protect their country in the face of an enemy they knew was impossible to defeat. It was on that battlefield Lionel gained respect for bravery and death. Lionel knocked his first arrow, his aura surging. Little Black Star. The little mink popped into existence out of a spinning black vortex, landing atop Lionel's head as though he had never left. Lionel's body was coated in a thin film of dancing shadows, his goldish bronze hair dancing wildly beneath his towering force. Crackling lightning, sharpening winds, dancing shadows that sounded like blades gliding across his arrow, Lionel took a deep breath and released his fingers on his exhale. As though his bow was a living entity extending from his own body, it followed his will, drawing a line from his eyes to his target. PCHU. Without ability to dodge, the first glider was pierced through the skull, but the others continued flying forward as though they hadn't sensed a thing. Lionel brought out a second arrow and fired again. Then a third. Then a fourth. In the blink of an eye, he had already sent out over a dozen arrows and reaped a dozen lives. However, he could see it all clearly. His senses were impossibly sharp, how could he miss it? Not a single one who lived flinched, not a single one thought of turning back, not a single one cowered. There were simply too many. There had only been around 500 predator birds, but each had 2 riders, making the gliders in the sky total over 1,000. Against a normal army, killing so many without giving them ability to retaliate would have caused them to stagger and run. But this army didn't seem to function by normal standards. And how could they? This wasn't a land they had come to conquer for mere wealth, this was about their lives, their future. To their backs wasn't a mere city, it was one filled with their family, their friends, those they had to protect. This wasn't a normal invading army, and the white troops of White City weren't a normal group of men and women. Lionel clenched his jaw. These were all fourth-dimensional warriors. The only reason he could kill them was because in their current positions, they had no ability to fight back. But, if he didn't put all of his strength into one arrow, he knew it would still be impossible to kill them even in this situation. He simply didn't have any large area of effect spells he could use to deal with them all at once. And, even if he did, he wouldn't have enough spirit pressure to easily affect such a large area without all but killing himself. As though the situation wasn't bad enough already, it only got worse in the next instant. White Knight Dior had locked onto Lionel's general location long ago. Yet, despite knowing his men were dying one after another, he still hadn't made a move against Lionel. And the reason for this soon became clear: quell your rage. A booming voice shocked the wild flock of predator birds. Lionel's heart trembled. The birds. It seemed that White Knight Dior wasn't designated as the head of this aerial squad without reason. The disordered, wild flock of predator birds suddenly regained their purpose, their crimson eyes all locking onto a certain direction. Lionel's blood ran cold. Chapter 447. The feeling of hundreds locking onto you, each without any other expressed goal than to taste your blood and reap your life. It was something Lionel had experienced before within the Merlin trials. But, there was something different about facing so many beasts. They didn't have a semblance of humanity, not an ounce of reason. There were no words he could use to get them to pause, nor were there any looming timers or rules he could use to pull himself out of this situation. It couldn't have been a more primal sense of fight or flight. It was either he defeated all of these enemies or escaped them, if not, he would die. Lionel suddenly felt a wave of interference play against his light refraction spell, distorting it. In the blink of an eye, it became a useless decoy hanging in the skies, exposing him to the senses of thousands. A shudder ran through Lionel's spine. This hadn't happened because he was careless or even because he had run out of energy. This was an ability. The birds. All this time Lionel had had the thought of being careful at the back of his mind. Though it was somewhat more difficult for a unit of warriors to use their abilities as freely in such a structure where the power of the whole was more important than the individual, Lionel knew that unexpected abilities were one of the things he had to pay attention to the most. In this aspect, Lionel was perfectly correct. The actions of White Knight Dior proved as much without a shadow of a doubt. What Lionel didn't expect, however, was for the abilities of the predator birds to be maybe even more important. All this time, Lionel had been so focused on their menacing exteriors that he never considered the fact their internal abilities were what truly should have struck fear in him. Lionel rapidly retreated, placing his body almost parallel to the ground as his jet-black surfboard sent him soaring backward. He quickly pulled out the dictionary, using the base of the surfboard to hide his actions. Those birds, what are they and what are their abilities? Ping *, replying to Seed, these birds are a subspecies of specially bred decoder beasts known as the jagged beak predator ravens. They are known for two main abilities, one related to their oddly shaped beaks and the second related to their pupils. Jagged beak, ability to disrupt force organization, predator pupils, ability to disrupt force organization. Lionel's heart trembled. The drawing of force arts was a delicate operation. Every force art type was a different language that spoke in a different way. But, in order to convey a certain message, it had to be exceptionally particular. This much was proved by when Lionel modified Camelot's force art in order to draw them faster. Doing just this small action caused the strength of these force arts to plummet. This was all to say something very simple. If these predator ravens could disrupt the organization of force arts, then spells were all but useless against them. Lionel now understood why it was that these birds were sent as the centerpiece of the first attack. Any large-scale formations Camelot wanted to put up to protect themselves would be absolutely useless before them. Even though the predator pupils were weaker than their jagged beaks in formation breaking, when 500 of them stared at a single point, what chance did a formation stand? And, beyond that, what if they began attacking that already weakened point with their beaks? Kwa-ah. Kwa-ah. Lionel's expression changed. His internal sight swept out, only to find that the distance between him and the flock of predator ravens had already halved. Their speed was inconceivable and clearly far beyond what his surfboard could muster. Maybe if it wasn't for the heavy crossbows still strapped to their backs, they would be even faster. Lionel locked eyes with the commander in the midst. He still stood tall, his hands clasped behind his back and his black robes fluttering wildly beneath the speed of his predator raven. In truth, White Knight Dior was inwardly surprised despite his indifferent expression. For one, he recognized Lionel. They would be foolish to not know of the talents of Earth before coming to invade them, but even beyond that, even if it wasn't about invading Earth, he would have heard of Lionel. After all, the rumors of him joining Valiant Heart Mountain without having to pass the trials had already spread like wildfire. But this was only a secondary reasoning. What shocked him the most was that despite 500 predator ravens locking onto Lionel at once, all they managed to do was distort Lionel's spell. Had it not been for Lionel dispelling the mage art himself, Khaled might still be looking toward a distorted image of Lionel. The White Knight narrowed his eyes. This was good. Now that Earth had evolved into a fourth-dimensional world, those who were born within it should be experiencing an evolutionary growing phase right now. Within the next few weeks to months, many of Earth's greatest talents would experience explosive growth in their abilities. This was why it was so important for them to be swift in their approach. This wasn't only about keeping the element of surprise, but it was also about ensuring that Earth didn't get any more chances to grow. Earth didn't have the foundation of cultivation. All they could rely on was technology and their gifted abilities. The evolution to the fourth dimension would already guarantee the near uselessness of technology, so they only had the latter to worry about. With a talent like Lionel before him, how could Khaled possibly allow him to live? Lionel was most definitely one of the greatest roadblocks standing between them and claiming this world for themselves. How fair was it for Earth to have so much potential and for terrain to have reached the end of its own? How fair was it for them to have to scratch and claw for everything while the people of Earth could be gifted the world? How fair was it for them to have to deal with people of their own world that would rather be the dogs of others rather than forging something for themselves? The truth was that there was no fairness in the world. Since that was the case, they would snatch what should be theirs themselves. And in White Knight Dior's mind, killing Lionel was the first step. Swarm him to death. Chapter 448. Lionel's feet shifted, slowing his black surfboard to a grinding halt. He pulled out the horn once again, but Khaled only sneered. Seeing his reaction, Lionel put the horn away without even blowing on it. Now that he understood the situation he was in, his mind flowed like water, jumping from idea to idea without pause or rest. It was already impossible for him to stop the gliders, but he had at least bought the baronies and Camelot time. By now, information about what was happening here should have long since been disseminated. A city falling from the sky was not something that could be missed, and Lionel had made certain of that. Lionel's goal had already changed. Assuming that he would be able to stop an entire army by himself had been foolish. Since he knew that he couldn't, he would focus on what he could do. His first priority was to survive. His second priority would be to kill this commander. Though Lionel set this second priority, he didn't spend any of his time hoping for it. He could sense that this commander was much stronger than he was. At his current level, Lionel couldn't even deal with the likes of Jilnia and those heirs of powers with any sort of assurance. At most, he could deal with exceptionally weak fourth-dimensional existences and those who couldn't defend themselves like those gliders. But, against someone like White Knight Dior, well, it was safe to say that if this battle was happening on the ground and not the air where Khaled could not directly track down and kill Lionel himself, Lionel would likely already be dead. Lionel's emotions seemed to vanish, his cold, calculating eyes locking onto the flock of birds around him as though he could no longer sense the gliders flying by below him. His mind reached an unprecedented sense of calm and seriousness that made the White Knight frown for the first time since this battle began. Lionel stood absolutely still in the air. Using his flying treasure as his base, he knocked another arrow, his breathing calm and steady. The way his eyes locked onto White Knight Dior made the latter feel as though there was nothing else around them, as though in this world there were only the two of them, as though if he made the slightest mistake, miscalculated just the smallest bit, that his life would be over. A halo of bronze appeared above Lionel's head, wafting out a majestic violet fog. It seemed to coat Lionel in the air of a king, even causing the atmosphere to become several times heavier. In the past, the gravity field ability of Lionel's metal synergy lineage factor had been exceptionally weak, barely increasing the gravity by a few percentage points, if that. But, after absorbing so much herb essence, just the presence of Lionel's halo alone increased it by 20%, giving a 1.2x effect at no expense to Lionel's own stamina. This might not seem like much, but aerial beasts were especially reliant on their light weight. Small changes could cost them a drastic amount of speed. And, at this moment, Lionel would take whatever advantage he could get. Shoo! A predator raven swooped down at Lionel, its eyes a furious shade of crimson. But, almost in the exact instant it reached the range in order to do this, Lionel had reacted first, letting loose an arrow. Kwawa! Kwawa! An arc of blood sprayed from the predator raven's eyes. It sprawled in the air, its wings flapping about so wildly that it lost several feathers in a matter of moments. Lionel's surfboard moved at his command. He seemed to move in a straight line, but the angles he took were just out of reach of several predator ravens. Without any long-ranged attacks, these ravens could only assault Lionel with their beaks and their claws. Their pupils were also useless if Lionel wasn't casting any spells. Though they could disrupt the organization of force, that was all. They couldn't dispel force or negate it. This meant that against force arts, their abilities were exceptional. But, against normal force attacks like Lionel's reinforced arrows, the amount of change they could cause was next to zero. To make matters worse for the flock of predator ravens, their size was simply too big. With only short-ranged attacks available to them and even the smallest of them having a wingspan of 5 meters, nimble movements were most definitely not their forte. In fact, even if it was, with how many of them had swarmed Lionel, sudden bursts of movement would cause more problems to themselves than they would to Lionel himself. Khaled narrowed his eyes. He thought that since he was facing a child, all he had to do was intimidate Lionel into making a stupid mistake with the use of his overwhelming numbers. He thought that Lionel wouldn't have the presence of mind to realize that he was keeping the predator ravens spaced out so that they wouldn't collide with one another. Yet, not only had Lionel realized this, he realized it immediately and even boldly acted upon it, even to the point of allowing the flock of ravens to surround him. If things kept going like this, without the room to even turn around, they would end up flying by Lionel and ironically letting him escape. But Khaled wasn't a fool. In fact, he was one of City Lord White's most trusted white knights. If not for this, how could he be allowed to man one of their most important missions? Disperse, he commanded calmly. In one swift motion, the predator ravens that had already passed Lionel by flapped their wings and spread out. Instantly, they had formed a large encirclement of Lionel, effectively cutting off the surrounding 500-meter space for their battlefield. Those ravens that were still surging toward Lionel spread their wings out wide, coming to grinding halts as they either shot up or down. Despite feeling that he could kill Lionel with a single strike if he got the opportunity, Khaled remained calm, retreating as well. In the center of it all that was left were a group of 3 predator ravens, the smallest and swiftest of them all, assaulting Lionel from all sides. Khaled's response immediately cured all of his formation's weaknesses. He had expected Lionel's calm expression to crack, but to his surprise, there wasn't even the slightest shift. From start to finish, Lionel had only shot a single arrow. The rest of the time, he spent calculating the safest lines of trajectory he would take to dodge around these beasts. Well, that was at least what it seemed like. But Lionel's real target had been his target from the very beginning. A particular bird beast that now had just a single eye and was in much too much pain to follow Khaled's orders perfectly. Chapter 449. Khaled's expression changed. He had already commanded that predator raven to man the perimeter, but it hadn't listened. No, it's not that it wasn't listening, something's making it not listen. This boy. Lionel had realized long ago that Khaled's commands could be interrupted. For Khaled to have been sent to command this aerial assault, it was likely that other than gaining City Lord White's trust, it was also due to his ability. By virtue of this, it was easy to extrapolate that Khaled had likely been the one in command of the predator birds from the very beginning. After Lionel realized this, he already had all the information he needed. The fact that his horn could disrupt Khaled's control, even for a moment, meant that it was very much possible for external sources to do so. So, the simple question was, what about pain? This much was easily confirmed. Though it was just for a moment, the predator raven completely disregarded Khaled's commands, almost completely disrupting the formation with its erratic flight in those moments just after Lionel pierced its eye. Though Khaled managed to regain control of the predator raven, there was one thing he didn't notice. Or, rather, 2 things packaged into one. The first thing was that Lionel had hidden a secondary damage spell within an arrow. And the second thing was that Lionel had hidden a smaller version of the force arts drawn onto his horn as well. The instant he realized that his hypothesis was correct, he activated the secondary damage spell, causing the raven a surge of pain once again. And, right afterward, he activated the beast-taming force arts to disrupt Khaled's second attempts at controlling the raven. When Lionel's light refraction spell was influenced, he realized a few things. For one, the influence of a single raven's pupils were exceptionally weak on him. If it wasn't for 500 disrupting his spell at once, it would have never distorted in the first place. And second, when he used his surfboard to block the view of Khaled while he pulled out the dictionary, he realized that the effect the ravens had on him were much weaker in that instant. That obviously meant that their abilities weren't area of effect, but rather truly reliant on their sight. At the very least, they had to have a line of sight to the force art they wanted to disrupt. This made Lionel realize his second very important thing. These damned birds couldn't disrupt a force art that had already been shielded, and definitely couldn't disrupt one too small for them to lock eyes on. At this point, though Khaled was startled, he still didn't understand what Lionel's plan was. He could tell that something was interrupting his control, and that this thing was most definitely the arrow still lodged in the raven's eye. But what was the purpose? There were over 500 jagged-beak predator ravens, all of which had long since surrounded Lionel and were waiting to taste his blood. What good was there to mess with just a single one? But Khaled's expression changed again when Lionel abruptly changed directions to, seemingly by coincidence, cross paths with the erratically flying bird. With a flip of his palm, Lionel's bow disappeared, only to be replaced by a pitch-black spear. Clang! 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 Chain domain. The predator raven was suddenly tightly bound in the sky, its wings pinned to body and its claws pressed flush against itself. Veins popped out across Lionel's forehead, but he didn't retreat. His back flexed as the predator raven hung in the air beneath his might. He could see its enraged eyes trying to bore into his soul. One was a blood red while the other dripped with crimson, its precious life dripping to the ground far beneath them. However, when it saw Lionel's cold, calculating eyes looking back toward it, the bird felt fear for the first time in maybe its life. It suddenly stopped struggling, its blood running cold. In a lot of ways, beasts were just more of what humans were innately but tried to hide. Their sense of strict hierarchy was even more damning, even more rigorous, even more demanding. When facing a being superior to you, beasts lowered their heads, even if it meant certain death. Lionel's spear shot into the predator raven's eye, an undeniable callousness in his gaze as he felt his blade run deep into its skull and through its brain. Spear force burst out, mincing the insides of the predator raven in an instant. But it was what happened next that made Khaled's heart truly seize. Lionel pulled out his spear, blood spraying through the air as he thrust forth once more. But this time, his target wasn't the dead raven but rather the crossbow machine strapped to its back. The strap was severed in a single strike, separating out from the predator ravens. Lionel's chain domain released the beast but latched onto the crossbow, causing it float before him in menacing fashion. Just like that, in what felt like the blink of an eye, the entire situation had shifted. All around, there were hundreds of predator ravens, each outfitted with a crossbow, but not a single one with the capability of firing one. And then there was Lionel. He was just one man, but he had suddenly become the center of the battlefield. His gaze still cool, suffused with indifference, he used his chain domain to load the first bolt, his eyes locking onto Khaled once more. A wave of danger seized the heart of the White Knight. Before, he felt his movements were clever. Clearing out the predator ravens to surround and suffocate Lionel seemed to have been the perfect move at the time. But now, he felt as though he had co-signed his own death. The irony of it was that as a commander, he didn't even have a crossbow of his own. The indifference in Lionel's gaze was almost beginning to drive Khaled mad. There was no sense of achievement or victory or even complacency or happiness in his eyes. It was as though what hovered before him wasn't a human, but rather a series of data points to be callously observed. And then Lionel released the bolt. Shoo! Bang! The sound barrier shattered in an instant. It happened so quickly that by the time it was registered, Khaled was already trying to dodge out of the way. But, unfortunately for the White Knight, Lionel's target was never him. KWWAA, it was a devastating sight. The cry of the raven hardly sounded before its head imploded into fleshly bits of crimson gore. The bolt was so powerful that it continued without losing momentum, piercing through the heart of another raven several hundred meters behind the first and causing it to implode as well. White Knight Dyer found himself falling through the skies, a half-stunned expression on his face. He lost? Lionel looked on from up above, his gaze locking onto Khaled's falling figure as his chain domain adjusted the aim of the crossbow toward the White Knight. Today, he would send a resounding message to the people of Terrain. Chapter 450. Khaled felt his heart seize. Something told him that no matter what he did, it would be impossible to dodge out of the way of this strike. The White Knight roared at the top of his lungs, unleashing all the force he had. There was simply no point in keeping anything in reserve. What good was reserve strength if he was dead? He didn't bother to pull out his glider. At this moment, he didn't want anything slowing his descent toward the ground. In fact, the faster he hit the ground, the better. As for whether he could survive such an impact, he would deal with just a single problem at a time. Bang! The sound barrier shattered. Roaring winds shot in every direction, clearing out a path for the released bolt. It felt for a moment as though it was cleaving the clouds with a single sword strike. Khaled flipped a palm, causing a spear to appear. He poured all of his force into it, striking out with all the might he could muster as he fell from the skies. At the same time, he kicked hard at the air, flipping himself upside down to careen toward the ground even faster. He hoped that the fact he was falling in the same direction as the bolt along with the fact he was putting his all into stopping it would dampen the strength somewhat. But, reality was cruel. Though he was correct in his assessment, the diminishment in strength was practically negligible. Khaled's spear point met the bolt, his eyes practically bulging out of their sockets under his strain. In that moment, he could swear that he had never put so much strength into a strike before. But his spear point splintered apart like dried weed. The bolt continued forward as though cutting through air, blasting a bloody hole so large in his shoulder that it took his arm along with it. White Knight Dior paled. His arm spun aimlessly in the air, sparkling droplets of crimson dancing around it. It looked as if a cannonball had taken a quarter of his body with it, trying its very best to reap his life. In that moment, his spinning arm was sheared apart by the harsh winds left trailing the bolt. Had it not been for the force Khaled had protecting his body, his head might have suffered the same force. Lionel coldly looked on from above, knocking another bolt. His senses swept over it all. It seemed that every crossbow had only been outfitted with 3 bolts. But, judging by their strength, Lionel understood why. With such devastating power, it was unlikely for any formation to survive the combination of the Predator Raven's abilities and this crossbow assault. In addition, weight was a huge issue when it came to such an aerial assault, and each one of these bolts rivaled even the crossbow itself in heft. But just one more bolt was fine. Since Khaled had given him such an opening, Lionel didn't believe he wouldn't be able to kill him. Lionel coldly aimed for the last time, watching the White Knight's falling figure. At that moment, several of the Predator Ravens had swarmed once again, trying to obstruct Lionel's sight toward their commander. But Lionel didn't flinch. If Khaled thought that he would lose sight because of this, he was sorely mistaken. From start to finish, Lionel's internal sight had been completely locked onto Khaled. Beyond this, would the bolt really be stopped by just a few bodies considering its strength? Lionel's chest expanded with an even breath. As though he was sinking with the crossbow, he released the moment he began to exhale, his calm breathing contrasting with the shattering boom of the bolt's speed. Qua! The bolt instantly tore through 3 raven bodies in the blink of an eye, showering the skies in crimson. Panic gripped Khaled's heart. He continuously kicked the air, trying to quicken his descent. Every time he did, he left concentric circles in the sky, accelerating himself downward with each attempt. But the bolt was simply too fast. He realized at that point that obstructing Lionel's vision had been useless. In fact, using so many ravens to block him only gave him easy access to more bolts. A strong feeling of helplessness gripped at Khaled's heart, but his expression remained the same as all others who had died to Lionel's hand on this day. He looked up toward his murderer, his gaze locking onto Lionel's. All he received in return was a plain stare, the same one that told him he was nothing but a data point, the same one that didn't seem to care for who he was as a person. Shoo! Bang! There was no sound when the bolt shot through Khaled's chest. In fact, it seemed as though the bolt had only flown through another patch of air. Rather, the huge crashing sound came from the bolt colliding with the ground and leaving a crater that rivaled the impact of a small meteor. For a moment, there was only a bloody hole. And in the next, Khaled's body imploded, shattering from the inside out into a rain of blood and gore. Having realized he made another mistake by calling the ravens to come and protect him, Khaled didn't bother to protect himself in the end, opting to simply stare at the man who ended his life. It was the kind of look only a man dauntless of death could form in his final moments. Maybe, from the very beginning, Khaled's anxiousness, his panic, his trembling, never had anything to do with the danger his life was in and everything to do with his unwillingness to fail the mission he was given. Lionel took a deep breath before releasing the crossbow in his chain domain and gasping for breath. He coughed several times, his lungs screaming beneath the strain. Yip! Yip! Lionel's chest heaved as he tried to give the little mink a reassuring smile. Calculating the trajectory of such a fast bolt hadn't been a problem for Lionel. Others couldn't guarantee such accuracy and could only use these crossbows as siege weapons, but Lionel was different. This was all to say that the reason for his fatigue wasn't this, but rather his use of his chain domain. But, it couldn't be helped, his surfboard couldn't fit such a large, heavy crossbow onto it. Lionel shook his head, turning his gaze toward where the gliders had disappeared to. By now, they were definitely closing in on the first barony. Even without the predator ravens, that city didn't stand a chance against so many fourth-dimensional existences. Damn it. Chapter 451. Lionel was just one person. Before he even battled White Knight Dior, he had already tired his mind using so many wind spells. After this battle, he was even more spent. Lionel finally steadied his breathing and looked around at what was left of the predator ravens. Unfortunately, Lionel didn't have an easy method of controlling these beasts. His horn was designed for third-dimensional beasts. But, even then, he couldn't precisely control those third-dimensional beasts. He could only rile them up into a frenzy and give them simple commands like pointing out a target to trample and targets to avoid like he had done in his final battle on Camelot. This time, what Lionel had done was even simpler. He poured his dream force into the horn in order to influence these massive predator birds. Essentially, he forced them into temporary madness, and this was the extent of his abilities. Plus, even if Lionel could make use of these birds, he wouldn't dare to. Believing that White City only had a single method of controlling these ravens would be absolutely foolish. If Lionel brought these birds into battle and they were suddenly turned against him, that would be the worst kind of mistake. Such a thing could completely turn the tide of battle. That said, Lionel also couldn't allow White City to so easily gain back these beasts for nothing. Lionel was absolutely certain that the loss of 500 of these predator ravens would sting for them. But, how could he easily get rid of them? Lionel's eyes flashed. Little Black Star. Yip! Yip! The little mink launched himself off of Lionel's head, diving down and through the skies. It quickly came back with a shadow ball it eagerly swallowed from the top of Lionel's head. Lionel nodded. Though he had to dispel Little Black Star's sharpening ability, which had come in very useful several times already, he had no choice but to make a sacrifice in this matter. Command them to battle to the death. Lionel said. Yip! Yip! Lionel didn't have the heart to monitor such a scene, so he allowed the little mink to oversee it as he descended from the skies. By now, Aina had dug up several dozen knights, most of whom were heavily injured and unconscious. Lionel frowned because he didn't see Lancelot among them. It can't be that Lancelot really died, right? In the beginning, Lionel had been paying attention so that he could direct Aina. But, after a while, he had to completely focus on the battle, so he sent all the locations at once and focused his everything on Khaled. Aina raised her brows when Lionel appeared. You're fine? Did you ever doubt it? Lionel asked with a grin. Seeing that Lionel was in the mood to lighten the atmosphere, Aina felt a weight on her chest lower. Her senses weren't as powerful as Lionel's. So, through the dust cloud, she couldn't really see or feel what Lionel was facing. She felt somewhat better knowing that it couldn't have been too dangerous, then. Of course, had she known the truth, let alone feeling relief now, she wouldn't have even allowed Lionel to go. But as the saying goes, ignorance is bliss. Seemingly realizing Aina's line of thinking, Lionel frowned. What happened to your sense-boosting treasure? Lionel remembered that Aina had used one of her quasi-bronze rewards from the Joan Zone on a headpiece that covered her one weakness. But, ever since they reunited, Lionel hadn't seen it again. Even to the current Lionel, a quasi-bronze treasure was a big deal. Currently, he only had one broken one he had yet to repair, while the second was his force-crafting quill. Losing such a treasure was definitely a big deal. Aina hesitated. She seemed to flash back to memories she didn't quite want to remember. Lionel's frown deepened when he saw Aina's reaction. Just what happened to her on terrain, exactly? It seemed as though every time he got close to touching upon it, she would pull back. Lionel never pressed Aina to tell him anything, especially when it was related to her family. But he didn't have any reason to believe that this was related to the Brazinger family, and he was serious about the words he had spoken to her before. He wanted Aina to lean and rely on him. But, if she never opened up to him, such a thing would be impossible. Though Lionel had taken Mordred's advice and stopped being a pansy, if he was always the only one pushing, even he could grow tired of such a thing. I lost it to an invalid. Lionel's eyes widened. What? Lionel panicked slightly, taking a step toward Aina as though he wanted to check if she was injured anywhere. It was completely irrational considering this must have happened months ago, but he couldn't help himself. The invalid Aina must be referring to was most definitely from terrain. Any invalid that had lasted so long on an old world was powerful beyond Lionel's imagining. One had to remember that invalids were only born from those who failed to awaken their abilities. They couldn't be birthed from those who succeeded, nor could they reproduce amongst themselves. This meant that the same population of invalids a world produced in the very beginning would be the very same population of invalids they had until the day the world died or all the invalids were eliminated. There were very few, exceptionally rare exceptions to this rule. Any instances that could break this rule would be cherished by invalids all over. Though terrain was weak, it was still a world with hundreds of years of history within the fourth dimension. This meant that any invalid Aina ran into was definitely at least that old. And, at such an age, the likelihood that they'd be a variant invalid shot through the roof. Lionel held on to Aina's shoulders, his heart beating even more wildly than when he had been battling a white knight far beyond him in strength. He truly felt like he had almost lost Aina forever. Just what happened, exactly? Chapter 452. Seeing Lionel's reaction, Aina didn't know how to react herself for a long while. The level of worry in his gaze, even for something that had long since passed, left her feeling at a loss. It wasn't a big deal, I'm here, aren't I? Lionel frowned at this response. He could sense Aina pulling away. Such a scene made him sigh and release his grip on her. Where is Lancelot? Did you not find him? Lionel changed the topic, but this left Aina at even more of a loss. Forcing things and reaching the end goal as quickly as possible always seemed like the path with the most satisfaction. A slow, long grind wasn't something most people wanted to deal with, and it was even something that scared most away. Though Lionel had spoken so many heartfelt words to Aina, they were ultimately words he had spoken himself. They weren't words that Aina had said, nor were they necessarily the way she, herself, felt. Whether she did or not wasn't something Lionel knew, nor was it quite the point regardless of what the truth was. What truly mattered was that even if she did, she wasn't at a point where she was ready to say them. This wasn't necessarily the end of the world. The pursuit of Aina had always been a one-person affair. Lionel never took Aina's standoffishness to heart because in his mind, it was his task to get her to warm up to him. If he failed, then it was because he was inadequate. It wasn't her fault. But this very same logical mind of Lionel's also understood that relationships weren't supposed to work in this way. As logical as he was, he also had exceptionally high emotional intelligence. He felt that his and Aina's relationship had taken a step forward she very clearly wasn't ready for. When things reached such a point, dragging her along would do more harm than good. However, this abrupt change in Lionel from overly caring to, as though he had flipped a switch, strictly business. It left Aina not knowing how to face him. Maybe for the first time, she realized just how true Lionel's words from before were. He didn't lie to her, there was no hidden truth she had to uncover. He laid out the way his mind worked and the kind of person he was right before her. Lionel might have been kind and caring, but it was all built upon a foundation of cold calculation. What drove him first and foremost was logic. Since he decided Aina wasn't ready to truly treat him as her boyfriend, he took a step back with ease, almost too much ease. Watching it all play out exactly how Lionel described left Aina feeling somewhat cold. She realized that if there really came a day where she didn't trust him, where she didn't lean on him as he would lean on her, he really wouldn't come to save her. Aina's lips trembled, but she clenched her jaw and swallowed hard, forcing back the emotions she was feeling and not allowing her tears to fall. Her small reactions were missed by Lionel, who had started to analyze the fallen knights, calculating if he could spare the stamina to heal them and by how much he would be able to do so. While I was digging up the others, Lancelot managed to climb back up himself. He gathered the ones who could still fight and rushed off to the Lin barony. If it wasn't ruined, they plan on taking a shortcut to the backside of the barony and hopefully help fortify their defenses. Lionel raised his brows when he heard these words, looking back toward Aina. By now, she had already gone back to normal as though nothing had happened. They have a chance to make it before the gliders get there. Though the gliders had a head start and were flying through the skies, because they were gliding rather than truly flying, their speed was obviously lacking. Lionel doubted that the loss of their commander would slow them by much. Such organized armies definitely had a clear line of succession. Those who were meant to step up had likely already done so. Lionel wouldn't underestimate such an army in the slightest. Did they describe the shortcut to you? Lionel asked. Aina shook her head no. Lionel could only accept this. He hadn't been too hopeful to begin with. There was no time to do such a thing. And, even if there was no guarantee the explanations would have been clear enough to make use of them. Yip. Yip. At that moment, little Blackstar dove down from the skies, skipping on his little shadowy platforms to dive into Aina's arms. Lionel smiled lightly. Done? Yip. Yip. Lionel nodded. Pass me their beast crystals and crossbows, they might be useful in the future. Yip. Yip. Little Blackstar vanished into Lionel's spatial ring and entered the segmented cube with ease. Sometimes Lionel wondered if the little guy had a spatial affinity rather than a dark elemental affinity. But, he knew better. Though they looked quite similar in function, they were very different. Those with space elemental affinities were moving through space, whereas little Blackstar was entering and exiting the shadow world. They were functionally the same, but technically different. After transferring all the beast crystals and crossbows from his shadow world and into the lab setting, the little mink dove out and back into Aina's embrace. Lionel looked over the knights again and cast a quick, grand heal, a few times. When he was sure that none of their lives were in danger and that a few would wake up soon, he called down his jet black surfboard again. Stepping onto it, Lionel turned a light smile toward Aina and stretched out a hand. Aina was a bit stunned, but still reached out. Hang on tight, Lionel said, wrapping an arm around her waist. Aina subconsciously wrapped her arms around Lionel's back as they shot into the skies. Yip. Yip. The little mink called out in dissatisfaction, feeling squished. Without a choice, the little guy could only wiggle out and find a new location within the segmented cube. Maybe going to tease Tolliver would make it feel better. Aina, however, looked up to view of Lionel's side profile. Realizing that he wasn't paying attention to her, she lowered her head back into his chest. A single tear fell from her eyes, but just as quickly as it appeared, it was absorbed by Lionel's robes. Chapter 453. Camelot suffered a great blow on the first day. White City's assault was swift and didn't contain the slightest hint of mercy. By the time Lionel and Aina made it to the city, it was already under siege by those over 1,000 gliders. Realizing it was a lost cause, rather than trying to fight a losing battle, Lancelot focused all his efforts on retreat, evacuating as many as he could. Lionel and Aina of course spent their time helping these efforts. Though Lionel had the crossbows now, he could at most shoot a single one at a time. This was the limitation of his chain domain. Even when he wasn't in the skies, he realized that the trouble loading the crossbows was greater than he originally thought. The amount of strength it took was astronomical and beyond him. One solution to this was to rely on Aina to do this, but then came the problem of aiming. Only Lionel could make a siege weapon like those massive crossbows accurate enough to target single individuals. Even if Aina loaded the crossbows for him, he would still need to aim them. And he could obviously only aim a single one at a time due to the limitations of his chain domain. A target was always changing and shifting their position. Lionel couldn't possibly expect to aim so many crossbows at once with such a blatant weakness. And aiming just one and firing a single bolt at a time couldn't possibly allow him to stop an army of over 1,000, especially with how dauntless they were. It was better to keep the crossbows as a trump card for the future. Lionel even thought it might be nice to spend some time modifying them to make them easier to use. With his current strength, his imprint on this war definitely wouldn't be made by his fists. If he wanted to have an impact, it would definitely have to be with his crafts. Lionel returned to Camelot to find the dark atmosphere he had originally seen had become even heavier. What no one could have possibly expected was for a new enemy to appear before they even finished dealing with the Empire. Not only was this enemy more cruel than the Empire, but they even seemed to be more powerful. Lionel and Aina were eventually led to their rooms. But, who knows if Mordred got to the organizers or not, but it was once again just a singular room. Lionel swept a glance around. Though the room was just as if not more luxurious than the one Mordred had given them, it was levels lower in romantic hues. In such a situation, it felt difficult not to read more into this than one should. Rather than warm lavender, red and violet colors, it had a bland whiteness to it. And, instead of a refreshing, soothing scent, the room didn't have a particular smell to it at all. The neutrality of it all hung with an odd heaviness. Well, this was the case to Aina. For Lionel, he didn't feel any particular way, as though he had already disconnected himself from it all. With a flip of his palm, the segmented cube appeared and expanded to its 5 by 5 by 5 meter size. Despite its size, it only took up about 20% of the large room. If you want to use the cleansing waters, you can. It should be easy for you to enter, just reach out with your internal sight. I'm going to go and see if I can gather any materials from Camelot's warehouses. If I can't, I'll also speak to M to see if the Demon Empire has the things I need. Materials? Aina asked softly. Emicham, Lionel nodded. I'm not very powerful now, so all I can do is make things with my hands. If there's an opportunity, they'll make a replacement for the headpiece you lost. You're a force crafter? Aina's soft voice carried a hint of surprise. Lionel grinned. How is it? I'm pretty amazing, right? Lionel's smile seemed to light up the room. Though this space already had plenty of sunlight rebounding off its white walls, it lacked the same warmth. Aina didn't move even a long while after Lionel had left. Eventually, she walked slowly to the bed, crawling onto its head and pulling her knees into her chest. A touch of redness crept onto her nose as her eyes watered. She stared off into empty space, seemingly looking at nothing and thinking of nothing. But the emotions threatening to spill over were undeniable. She squeezed her knees tighter. At first it seemed as though she was simply in an emotional state, but soon, it reached beyond that. The crackling of bones sounded in the quiet room. It took only a moment for one to realize that the bones that were breaking were Aina's own. As quickly as she broke them, she healed them, only for her to fracture them once more. In any other context, this was just training taken to an extreme. Breaking down one's body and reforming it was the simplest form of training. However, within context, it felt like something much darker, like a heavy fog hanging over a young woman's life. A person's worst enemy could often be themselves. In the beginning, it might have seemed that Lionel was the only one who needed to grow and to mature, but it was easy to forget that Aina, too, was just an 18-year-old girl. Aina grew up alone. Under the welfare of the empire, most in thanks to her 5-star professional evaluation, she was never homeless nor starving. But, regardless, she was alone. She didn't meet Yuri until the later years of her middle school days and always had trouble connecting with her or anyone, for that matter. She was stuck in a quagmire of her own thoughts. Even if she wanted to connect with someone, she had no idea how to. Aina continued to stare off into blank space, her tears half fallen, but not quite, her emotions half spoken, but not quite, her heart half broken, but not quite. Chapter 454. You want to enter our treasure vaults? Arthur's lip twitched as he looked toward Lionel. What kind of king would allow someone not even of their kingdom to randomly enter their vaults and choose as they please? Even if one was a loyal citizen, it might only be possible to enter once every several years to pick out 1 or 2 things. Yet, not only was Lionel asking for free rein to do as he pleased, he wasn't even a person of Camelot. Despite this, Arthur felt like he couldn't say no. Maybe aside from him and a few founding members of Camelot, Lionel had done more for the kingdom than anyone else. And, beyond that, Lionel was the reason he felt happier now than he had in a very long time. He had even managed to have dinner with his daughter just last night. Of course, Arthur didn't say these things aloud. After all, he had just lost 1/5 of his kingdom and was in line to lose much more of it before all of this was over. Plus, many of his citizens were in danger. But, after making his decision, he had already been ready to lose everything. So, how much of a need was there for him to care about such a loss? Yes. Lionel smiled and nodded as though it wasn't a big deal. Are you trying to extort me, kid? Exactly. PFT, King Arthur's head snapped in a particular direction. But, by the time he locked eyes on his son, Lionel was already looking off into the distance as though nothing had happened. Nice weather we're having, huh? Lionel rubbed his nose, scanning the room. Unfortunately for his act, the only window in the throne room was exceptionally high up and was angled such that it only shone a small light on the throne itself. So, how could he possibly know with any sort of detail the kind of weather they were having? King Arthur shook his head. Lionel had always been so obedient. He couldn't help but feel that Lionel was having a bad influence on his son. At this point, Lionel's smile faded somewhat and he became more serious. Arthur, I've told him this already, but you should be aware as well. If you don't want to lose too much of your power after submitting to the Empire, what's important is to show your worth. Repelling this invasion is a great opportunity for you. Since Terrain dares to do this, they're confident. I'm certain that they've scouted out Earth and understand more about our world than even maybe we do. The Empire will definitely be in trouble and Terrain definitely won't stop until they claim the world for themselves. The greatest variable in this war is you all, Camelot and the Demon Empire. Terrain? King Arthur raised an eyebrow. You seem to know a lot about these enemies? Not a lot, just more than most. And you believe that by opening up the vaults to you our likelihood of winning will be greater? Exponentially so. And how am I supposed to make certain that you aren't embezzling anything? Lionel blinked and smiled once more. You don't. Just take it as my worker's fee. Shameless. These are your vaults? Lionel raised his brows in surprise. Lionel smiled. Yes, this should be the greatest treasure store on Camelot. The only rival to us might be Big Sister's empire. The area was much larger than anything he expected. The vaults were located on the basement floor of the castle. And, despite the size of the castle itself, it took up several floors, a whole 3 levels to be exact. The amount of space totaled up to more than a square kilometer. It was absolutely inconceivable that there would actually be enough treasure to fill it all up with. The first floor was filled with stacks of gold coins. Lionel felt as though he had walked into a dragon's den. He was certain that just the existence of this place was a huge hazard. If one of these gold piles slipped, it could easily bury someone alive. Still, Lionel wasn't very interested in these piles of gold. On Earth, gold had lost its value a long time ago. Other than being a good conductor, it wasn't very useful otherwise. It was too soft of a metal and not very good for weapons or armors. It was unfortunate for Camelot, but it seemed that in any places other than their kingdom, this first floor of treasures was quite useless. However, there were 2 more floors below this one. This, Lionel didn't know what to say for a long time. The store of ores seemed endless. They piled up into what seemed like perpetuity. Though most were pseudo-fourth-dimensional ores, their value was so much greater than the gold on the first level that they couldn't even be properly compared. It felt like blasphemy to do so. And here Lionel thought he was somewhat of a tycoon after mining the hive, only to find out that he was still very much a poor man if he was comparing himself to a true kingdom. But this made sense. Camelot had existed as a pseudo-fourth-dimensional world for a very long time. Over the years, it only made sense that they would gather so many precious ores. Even if there was nothing else, Lionel felt that he could create so much with just what was before him. He saw several mountainous piles of herb ore, countless types of vein and elemental ores. He even saw some true fourth-dimensional ores hidden within that might have slipped through the cracks. Yet, there was still one more floor. As shocked as Lionel was on the second, the third floored him. He finally bowed down. He was indeed a poor man. He apologized for ever believing that he was wealthy. No matter where he looked, there were endless mountainous piles of fourth-dimensional ores. If the gold piles could have buried a normal human, these could bury even Lancelot and King Arthur. Seeing such a sight, Lionel thought that King Arthur was too stingy for even hesitating to say yes to him. Even if he wanted to take and use it all, would he even be able to? But, at the same time, Lionel was shocked. Just how did a pseudo-fourth-dimensional world like this produce so many fourth-dimensional metals? There even seemed to be more of them than there was on the second level. How did that even make any sense? It was safe to say that any guilt Lionel would have felt taking advantage of Camelot like this flew out the window. You're tuning in to the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.